Hello everyone, this is Kawainame TV. This video is all about what if Neji become a ghost. This story is a fanfiction. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Kindly click the bell button for more updates. Chapter 1 Forfeit, Hinata. Neji's voice rang in her ear. Hinata stood on a cliff, looking down into the abyss in front of her feet. The fresh wind stroked through her hair as she studied that darkness. The place reminded her of Naruto's tales of how his sensei Jiraiya had pushed him down a cliff to learn how to summon Gamabunta. She still heard Kiba's laughter when Naruto told him that story. Was this the same place? Hinata sighed. Her eyes itched, tired and puffy from the sleepless nights and tears after the war. The war. The day her cousin died for her. Hinata's hand tightened its grip around the flowers she had collected only minutes ago. After Neji's death, Hinata started hearing the words Neji had said to her during the Chunin exams. For your weakness. Forfeit, Hinata. Neji's words from her memory hypnotized her. Looking into the abyss one more time, she was mesmerized by it. That darkness was endless. This place drew her in, but why? Something inside of her wanted to turn around and run back home. However, she had to look down. She let the yellow flowers in her hand fall into the void and watched them gracefully swirl in the wind before sinking down. I don't want to go down there. Hinata took a step back. That's not my way. The reality cannot be changed, Hinata, Neji's voice told her again. The reality that her cousin died because of her. Why did she hear his voice from her memories? What was the voice trying to achieve? You don't understand anything. You can barely stand. Forfeit. Listening to Neji's voice repeating his taunts became more and more difficult. It was true, her knees were about to give out. Hinata's gaze wandered into the darkness of the abyss. What was at the bottom? Was this what the voice of her cousin was trying to tell her? To forfeit and fall. But, Hinata stuttered quietly into the void, it's not my way. Clenching her fists, her fingernails dug into her palms until they hurt. I should go home. But then her cousin's voice started again. Forfeit. You don't understand. Hinata shook her head. I don't want to give up. Your own weakness. My own weakness. A pain in her core struck her. Neji died because of me. Tears welled up in her eyes and started running down her cold cheeks. It's true, I am still weak. Forfeit. She took a small step towards the abyss and stood on the edge again. People cannot change. That is destiny. Destiny, Hinata repeated slowly. Destiny. Her gaze fell into the darkness beneath her. Standing in his bedroom, Kiba opened the window to let in some fresh air. To his surprise, a buzzing swarm of bugs flew in uninvited. His eyebrow twitched as he observed them swirling around in his room. Hopefully, they would all find the window to leave. What do you want? I assume you know Shino's out of the village with his dad. The bugs swarmed on Kiba's desk, crawling around hectically. What do you think they want from us, Akamaru? Biting you again. After rolling his eyes at the insects, Kiba grinned at his large dog. Akamaru answered with a growl. Yeah, you're right, Akamaru. It's like he stopped. Shino's bugs had formed some words, bad intuition. Look out for Hinata. Kiba's eyes widened. He rushed to grab his jacket and stormed out of his room. Akamaru. His ninja hound followed him. They ran out of the house and outside on the streets to search for their teammate. Shino and his intuition. Kiba rolled his eyes again, hoping it was just a false alarm. What does he mean? But still, after all that had happened to her, I better check on her. Just to make sure. Kiba knew Hinata was still grieving after Neji's death. Nobody could expect her not to. Still, her friends were worried about her. The duo started tracking Hinata's smell, a smell they fortunately knew by heart after all the years as teammates and friends. As they tracked the invisible trace, the two ran as fast as they could. I hope Shino's wrong, Kiba exclaimed, and Akamaru let out a small bark. Putting all their strength into their jumps, they followed the smell. Damn, where is she? After running around for a longer time, he started to grow more concerned. She was neither at home nor anywhere nearby. They started to follow the trail out of the village. Still standing on the edge of the abyss, Hinata couldn't help but feel hypnotized by the darkness. It fit what she felt inside. Life appeared strange to her as it could end just in one moment. One moment of weakness. One moment of inattentive behavior. Forfeit Hinata, Neji's voice commanded in her mind. Hinata sighed deeply. No, it was time to get rid of the nasty voice inside her head. Acting tough is useless. The memory of Neji's words echoed in her ears. Why couldn't she hear what he had said before his death? Her head hurt. Suffering from insomnia the last few days made it difficult to concentrate. Still, she managed to take one step back again. With her hands on her border of the cliff, she kneeled and looked down again. Why was it so hard to go away? The strange toxic voice from her memories had too much influence on her today. Putting her fingers on her cheeks, she noticed the wetness from her tears. They dripped into the void like small raindrops. Finally managing to cover her eyes with her hands, she leaned back. Loser. Forfeit. Loser. Neji's voice taunted her just like in the exams. She had lost that day. He had almost killed her. I don't go back on my word, Hinata mumbled the phrase she had learned from Naruto. The phrase had enabled her to overcome difficult situations in the past. Giving up wasn't an option for her. Now I just need to stand up. She felt so tired and weak, her body didn't want to obey. Insomnia and grief had worn her down. NGHH, trying to command her body to move again, Hinata grew more and more desperate. Weakness, Neji hissed at her. Shut up, she whispered. At that very moment, another wave of exhaustion hit her. She was about to faint. It was vital to crawl into safety, or she could fall down into the abyss. But she couldn't. Her eyes widened in shock. I can't control my body anymore. Neji, help me. Finally, her body started to slowly slump down to the front, leaning dangerously near into the abyss. No, I don't want to. Hinata tried to sit up again. However, her will wasn't enough this time. Slowly, she felt being drawn out of consciousness. A memory of Neji and Naruto flashed in front of her eyes. Kiba, Shino, weak. The nasty memory voice rang in her mind again. Told you to forfeit. Gravity pulled her body into the abyss as she slid down on her knees. Her eyes were open in horror, but she couldn't move. It was a state between consciousness and unconsciousness. No, please no. She felt her body sinking down. Damn. Either move or faint. Hinata, Neji's voice suddenly commanded in her head. His tone was different from the taunting voice before. The voice sounded lower, more mature somehow. And more familiar. Neji. But she was falling while conscious, still unable to move her body. Hinata. Kiba and Akamaru arrived at the abyss. When Kiba spotted Hinata sliding into the abyss, his eyes widened in shock, but his feet ran as fast as they could. He wouldn't let her fall. Ducking to get faster, he sprinted towards her. Shit. Kiba couldn't let her fall down. He couldn't. No way. He sprinted as fast as he could. Some seconds before her body slumped down into the dark void, Kiba gripped Hinata's leg to pull her out of the opening. He dragged her back away from the border of the cliff. Then, he pulled her into the safety of his arms. Sitting on his butt on the grass, he held her closer into his arms. A desperate frown was on top of his shocked face, eyes still opened wide, blood pumping in his veins. What the fuck was that? As adrenaline finally rushed through her body, Hinata could move again. She looked at him, eyes wide open in shock. Kiba. Kiba put his hands on her shoulders. Then, he pressed her away from his chest and glared at her. His grip was painfully firm. Hinata knew she needed to explain the situation. List. What was that? Kiba shouted at her, his hands on her shoulders shaking her. Akamaru barked loudly to support his friend's scolding. Finally, Kiba stopped shaking her and waited for her response. Aye, as always, her stutter returned whenever she was very nervous. Hinata, what the fuck did you intend to do? I didn't. It was. Despite her confusion, Hinata tried to put everything into words. I'm sorry. You're sorry. Kiba repeated in disbelief, sounding uncharacteristically calm and low. His gaze turned to her kunai and her jacket she had left on the grass behind them. Kiba gritted his teeth as a dark shadow covered his face. You almost fell off the cliff. Hinata swallowed, feeling the graveness of his words. It's not. Did you try to? He didn't finish the sentence, lowering his head for some seconds. Tears shimmered in his eyes. No. Hinata shook her head firmly. Her eyes got watery. No. You have to believe me. Kiba's jaw tightened. Could he believe her after seeing all of this? We'll need to talk to your father about it. No. Her eyes widened. What would her father do if he heard that? Hinata would never be allowed to walk alone, or she would be locked up in the compound. Either way, she wouldn't have any kind of freedom. Tears started to stream down her cheeks. Please don't do that, Kiba. He gulped loudly. Then explain it to me. Hinata tried to put together what she could tell him. I heard Neji's voice from my memory, wouldn't sound very sane. I was looking down the cliff, and suddenly I felt like fainting. I haven't slept for some days. It was the truth. Why were you here? I searched for wildflowers to press. It wasn't a lie because that was the main reason she went to this place. The grass was full of different beautiful flowers blooming despite the current autumn month. Flowers. Kiba raised his eyebrow. His eyes wandered around until they stopped at the bunch of flowers lying next to her kunai. Hinata nodded her head firmly. You know me for so long. Look me in the eye and decide if I'm lying to you. His face remained uncertain. Trust me, I didn't want to jump. She hoped her friend would believe her. Kiba looked at her eyes for some time, exhaling and inhaling deeply. After a while, he sighed, pulling her close into a hug. I do believe you. But please, you need to be more careful. I will. The comfort and warmth of the hug made her feel safe for now. The nasty voice in her head was silent, too. I know you're suffering. Kiba patted her back. Hinata, I wanna help. No, you're not alone. His sad voice made Hinata feel even more guilty. She would never do something to hurt her friends. Her desire for protecting the ones she cherished was undiminished. But still, she had failed to protect Naruto, and thus her cousin had died. Hinata sobbed silently. I know. And I promise to protect you. Yeah, sure. We need to look out for each other. Finally, Kiba's characteristic grin appeared on his face. He seemed to recognize Hinata's poor physical condition since he picked her up in his arms and stood up. He still held her close. Let's go home, alright. Okay, she whispered into his chest while her tears were soaking into his shirt. Kiba put Hinata on Akamaru's back and picked up her belongings off the ground. When his hand aimed for the bunch of flowers she had collected earlier, a swarm of insects crawled over his fingers. Shino. For some seconds, he stood still, eyeing the bugs. Akamaru waited for Kiba, so they could finally bring Hinata back to the Hyuga compound. Later, as Kiba walked home with Akamaru, he recapped the day. Somehow something was still missing in Hinata's explanation. He believed her, but he acknowledged that he would need to stay alert. Thanks for your intuition, Shino. Kiba shivered again and sighed. Damn, that was so close. He put his hand on his forehead and ground his teeth. What a day. After they said their goodbyes, Hinata shuffled to her room and sat down on her bed. The flowers in her hand landed on her cover. She remembered the voice of the younger Neji in her head. The memory of the Chunin exam taunting her, urging her to give up. After the war, she had heard that voice in her head sometimes. Most likely, it was the manifestation of her guilt. But the last time she had heard the voice today was different. She hadn't heard this voice after the war. Because that voice was Neji's voice. What did it say? Move or faint? What does that mean? Looking at the flowers, Hinata bit her lower lip. Was the voice also trying to force her to give up? But in a different way. Hinata sighed. Was her mind was becoming her enemy? Suddenly, she felt very tired again and laid her head next to the flowers on the bed. Finally, she could rest. The taunting voice was silent, allowing her to drift into sleep. When Hinata woke up the next morning, blue and red wildflowers stuck to her face. It was the first night of good sleep after Neji's death. Still, she couldn't forget the voice telling her to move or faint. It had sounded concerned, even horrified. What was that about? Chapter 2. You're seeing in your dreams during the daytime, Hinata experienced two kinds of states. Sometimes everything was as usual. No strange voice was inside of her. She felt like herself. On other days, the taunting voice repeated all the hurtful words again and again. Again and again. Hinata stood on their training field, a wide field surrounded by large oak trees and wooden training poles. A cool breeze caressed her cheeks. Closing her eyes, she concentrated on the playful wind. After some minutes, Kiba and Akamaru appeared on the field. The friends had agreed that some training together might be a good idea. Ready? Kiba grinned at Hinata, who was already in her fighting stance. The veins from her activated Byakugan pressed through her skin. She nodded her head eagerly. He instantly sprinted towards her. Kicks and punches flew at Hinata. Right, left, right. Up, down, down. Kiba was kicking and distributing hits while Hinata was practicing her defense. Each time his kicks aimed at her, she swiftly dodged. Her long hair swirled around as she concentrated on evading every one of Kiba's attacks. Both were sweating, puffing, and focusing on their spar. Kiba was spinning around until he tried another sneaky hit at her temple. Hinata ducked again. Hey! Kiba started distributing multiple punches at once. A small smile was on Hinata's face as she ducked again. Loser. Hinata suddenly heard the voice again and stopped for a millisecond. Kiba's punch almost hit her neck, but she stepped back in the last second. Kiba went to his knees and tried to kick off her feet. She jumped up to prevent his attack. So weak. Hinata flinched a little bit. Kiba's next kick hit Hinata right into the chest. She stumbled a little before going back into her defensive stance. Raising his eyebrow in confusion, Kiba continued with his hits. He spun around and targeted another kick at Hinata's abdomen. Seeing his kick coming, Hinata got ready to dodge when she heard little Neji's voice again. You're only holding him back with your weakness. This statement hit Hinata's emotional weak spot. Her eyes widened. I hold him back. Glancing desperately at Kiba, she immediately stopped her attempt to avoid his kick. In a twisted way, she even wanted the pain. Her head and shoulders just slumped down as she waited for him to knock her out. Bang! Kiba's kick made her fly far off the ground, right into a tree. Her body bounced off the firm trunk and slumped down into the wet grass. She sighed in pain. Hinata, Kiba ran over to her. Why didn't you dodge? I. Hinata sighed. I got distracted. By what? Kiba frowned, kneeling down to her. Hinata looked away. My own thoughts, I guess. HMPF. Kiba shook his head with a look of disbelief on his face. Hinata, I know you saw the kick. Did you want to be hit on purpose? Hinata stayed silent, not knowing what to answer. Her whole body hurt, her belly aching. I know you saw it. Kiba raised his eyebrows as a small grin flashed on his face. No need to hold back, hey. Am me holding back? Hinata asked weakly. Yeah, I mean, we're all on the same level, but you're pretty good at taijutsu after all. Winking at her, he reached out his hand to her to help her back up. Oh. Hinata took Kiba's hand, studying his facial expression carefully. His eyes indicated that his compliment was honest. Suddenly, she felt very stupid. Thank you, Kiba. Why did she listen to the voice in the first place? Now the pain in her abdomen intensified, and she flinched a little. Should we stop? Hinata dusted off her legs, her tummy still burning from the impact of Kiba's kick. She shook her head. Keep going. A wide grin appeared on Kiba's face. Yeah, I see you want your ass to be kicked today. Hinata chuckled and nodded slightly. After some additional rounds of training, they ate lunch together and headed back home. It had been a good day, almost like in the days before the war. Almost. Hinata sighed silently as tears pooled in her eyes when she walked down the street. Some hours later, when Hinata was lying in her bed, turning around to fall asleep, she heard the voice again. Desperately, she pressed her cushion onto her ears. But it didn't help. Forfeit. Weak loser, the little Neji snarled. Leave me alone. I don't want to hear it. Hearing the voice was especially hard because Neji was dead, and hearing him hate her made her feel guiltier. Whenever the voice stayed silent, Hinata felt more peaceful, happier, like herself again despite the sad thoughts spinning around in her head. However, this night the voice was taunting her on a loop. Falling asleep was like a release. When Hinata opened her eyes, she knew it was a lucid dream. Shino told her about those once. In these kinds of dreams, the sleeping person would be fully aware of dreaming and could even control the dream. Hinata knew the dream was lucid because it was different from the ones she usually had. Everything looked just like in the real world. Crystal clear and realistic. Hinata found herself in one of the familiar bathrooms of the Hyuga main building. It seemed to be night since no sunlight was coming through the window. The bathroom light on the ceiling was the only source of light in the large room. A tall figure stood in front of the sink. Neji. Hinata gasped as she spotted her cousin. For the first time after the war, she saw Neji in a dream. Her cousin looked like she remembered him to be. Long brown hair, pale skin, and light eyes. Standing in front of the sink, he looked at himself in the mirror above the sink. His reflection seemed to have caught his attention because he studied it for quite some time. As Hinata stood behind her cousin, she became aware that something was off. What is it, Neji? What are you looking at? She watched him activate and deactivate his Byakugan multiple times, which was odd because this wasn't a usual thing to do in front of the mirror. His fists were clenched, and his mouth showed a tiny smile that vanished then and turned into a concerned expression. Hinata wondered why his face expressed so much irritation. Was he looking at his caged bird seal? She looked over his shoulder into the mirror, seeing their reflections in the mirror. Neji's fingertips slowly touched his pale face as if he was trying to find something. How strange. Hinata felt a shiver on her skin. Then, he looked down on himself, pressing on his midriff area. His facial expression was indicating a particular concern Hinata couldn't understand. His hands traveled over his chest as if he wasn't sure whether his body was intact. A deep sigh escaped his mouth, which made Hinata gasp as well. But, she stayed silent, scared to say anything, afraid to end the dream. Finally keeping our disgusting mouths shut today, aren't we? Neji hissed angrily at the mirror. Disgusting mouths. Hinata stared at him with wide eyes. Who is he talking to? She still wondered if he had meant her, but he didn't look at her. It seemed that he was just talking to himself. After some time, Neji put his hands on the borders of the sink and lowered his head. This frantic pose awoke Hinata's desire to comfort him. Her hand reached out for him, resting on his shoulder. Instantly, his eyes focused on her hand. Neji. Hinata's voice broke as she finally said his name. In a swift move, he turned his head to the side, so one of his eyes could look at her. Hinata. Neji's mouth opened a little bit, seemingly in shock. His light eye looked right at her. However, he didn't move. He just stood there, looking in her direction. Hinata sighed deeply. Maybe he couldn't see her. It was a dream, after all. But somehow, that lucid dream was special to her. Slowly, she put her arms around Neji's body, hugging him from behind. Neji, I'm so sorry, she said softly, her voice filled with all her guilt. The embrace felt so incredibly real, warm and tight, filling her up with hope and comfort. Couldn't she just stay in that dream forever? Neji's body relaxed a little as she squeezed him a little bit tighter, pushing her face into his back. His back felt warm and alive. Hinata, he whispered, standing still. It was difficult to tell what he was thinking. His personality was mostly calculating and cold. He would always keep his distance. Is it really you? She nodded, breathing into his back. Seeing him being alive was the best dream she could have wished for. To hug him one more time, even if it was a dream, was comforting. In their family, they often acted cold and distant. Showing affection was not common and not desirable behavior. But since it was a dream, it didn't matter anymore. She could show her big brother how much she missed him. Further, engulfing in this wishful thinking eased her guilt and grief for some time, making her feel hopeful and carefree again. This is really interesting, Neji mumbled slowly. Hinata still pressed her face into his back, hugging him tightly. What were you doing on the cliff? Neji asked sharply. Oh, the incident some days ago. Hinata swallowed. I heard your voice. My voice. Neji repeated quietly, his body tensing up. Yes, it was you when you were younger. I often hear the words you said at the Chunin exams. That I should accept my weakness and give up. So that's why you went to the cliff. I felt drawn, I don't know why. I didn't want to jump. Hinata felt his body stiffen even more. And then I felt like fainting. Don't ever listen to that damned voice again, Neji commanded in a stern tone. Understand. Hinata nodded her head into his back. A silence filled the room before Neji spoke again. This voice you're hearing isn't me. It's some strange memory. It seemed that he wanted to continue, but then he stopped again. I know it's not you. Hinata squeezed him a little more. She could even feel his heartbeat on her arm. This dream was so realistic. It almost hurt her to acknowledge that it's just a dream. Good. Neji, I know that I'm only dreaming. Her voice trembled. To escape reality for a while, she tried hard to convince herself that this dream was real. However, as it was a lucid dream, Hinata knew exactly what had happened outside this reality. Still, I just want to stay with you for a short moment. Please. Hey, no need to sound so desperate, Neji said mockingly. Hinata softly chuckled at his usual blunt response. Silently, they stood there for some time. It was a strange sentiment as Hinata felt him breathing, being warm and alive again. Hinata swallowed at this painful thought. Neji cleared his throat and whispered, You should know I'm always by your side, Hinata. Oh, Hinata couldn't hear those empty phrases anymore. Sure. He always stays in your heart. He'll be with you forever. People would try to diminish her pain by saying meaningless platitudes. Neji is dead. The thought was in her mind like a thick thorn, festering more and more. He was not there anymore. He would never be there again. Always in my heart, sure. But this wouldn't make any difference because Neji was still gone. The reality was harsh, but Hinata knew she needed to accept facts. Except in this dream where he was still alive. You don't believe me, Neji asked. This time his voice sounded softer as usual. Slowly, Hinata shook her head into his back. Neji snorted at her answer. Knowing his family, he should have been aware that his cousin would discard such empty words. Why did he say it in the first place? It wasn't characteristic. Usually, he was rational and analytical. But it was still a dream, after all. Hinata guessed that her brain showed her the dream to soften her pain, smoothen her guilt, and provide closure. Thus, she decided to use the dream to clear her mind. Neji. Hinata's voice was breaking as tears rose in her eyes. I'm very, very sorry. Sorry. Neji asked slowly. Sorry for what? You died protecting me, and I was so weak. She couldn't hold her tears, and now they were streaming down her face. No, I chose to protect you. Neji's tone was determined and sharp. It was my own choice. My free will. Don't forget that. Reluctantly, Hinata nodded her head, her wet face still pushing into his back. You cry too much, Neji whispered almost softly. It's kind of painful to watch. Sorry, she mumbled. Indeed, crying could be considered one of her main pastime activities for the days after the war. Usually, she would hide somewhere to cry. Being alone with her pain was her only escape. Her clan had taught her that way of dealing with her emotions, and she had adapted it. You should get some rest, Hinata, he hummed, but she clung even more tightly to him. I don't want to. Hinata shook her head firmly. Don't want to go back. You need to. You can't change it anyway. She sighed deeply, knowing he was right. Realizing the reality was inevitable. Still, this lucid dream offered her the possibility to escape it for a while. Maybe, he started, but then he stopped again. Neji. Yes. Can't I just stay here for a while? She asked quietly, still snuggling herself into her embrace. Neji sighed, sounding annoyed. Still, she felt how he laid his hand on her arm, showing his agreement. They stood like this for some time. After some time, Hinata drifted off into a warm feeling, a warmth she couldn't describe. Little by little, she felt being pulled out of the dream, and darkness appeared in front of her eyes. In the morning, she woke up in a good mood. A small smile flashed on her face. Seeing Neji in her dream, speaking to him, had felt too good. Sitting up in her bed, Hinata looked at her hands. It felt too real. Hinata even felt the warmth of the embrace on her skin. How can a dream feel that real? The day passed quickly. Fortunately, the taunting voice was silent that day. Hinata was busy helping in the hospital. Trying to help other people seemed to be a good idea because missions got rare. At night, just before she fell asleep, she wondered whether she would ever experience another lucid dream again. She hoped so because maybe she could see Neji again. The next dream was strange. Hinata found herself outside on the streets when she spotted him. The degree of darkness outside indicated that it was past midnight. Panting nervously, Hinata followed Neji. Jumping from roof to roof, he stopped after they passed some houses, now looking down into the garden of a house. This house, who lives here? Hinata wasn't exactly sure. She watched Neji scan the area with his Byakugan before concentrating his chakra into his feet and walking down a wall leading to a window. Neji slipped through the window and she followed. Then she stopped in the window frame, looking into the small bedroom. Only 2 small candles on a desk lit up the room. On a small bed in the corner of the bedroom, Hinata spotted a slender frame. Tenten. Hinata finally recognized the brown-haired girl sitting on the bed. She wore her pajamas, her hair open and covering her shoulders. Hinata couldn't see Tenten's face since the light of the candles wasn't bright enough. Neji. Tenten whispered to Neji, who now stood in front of the bed. Yes, Tenten. It's me. Hinata watched Neji clench his fists slightly. I can't keep visiting you. Why? Tenten's voice was filled with sadness. She stood up from the bed and walked over to Neji until she was standing right in front of him. Please stay. Neji put his hands around her waist and pulled her a little closer to himself. Her hands softly touched his jaw, and he smiled a soft smile at her. Tears welled up in her eyes. The two were looking each other right in the eyes for some time. Their heads moved towards each other, lips moving closer. Both closed their eyes. I shouldn't be here. Hinata felt the blood rising up her cheeks. The whole scene conveyed an intimacy she wouldn't want to disturb or observe in the first place. I need to leave. Right now. Quickly, she turned around and jumped out the window frame. After rushing through the garden and jumping over the roof of a house, she landed on the street and headed to the Hyuga compound. She felt like her face was still burning in embarrassment. What a strange scene. Why am I dreaming this? Walking down the street, Hinata spotted Kiba and Akamaru walking right in front of her. Hinata ran towards him. Kiba. Kiba stopped in his tracks and looked around with a confused facial expression. Akamaru's loud bark echoed in the streets. At that very moment, Hinata felt a stinging pain in her core that made her feel like she was torn into 2 pieces. Screaming in agony, she crouched down on the street. Ah, Hinata. Kiba's voice rang in her ear. He seemed to run closer to her. Her pain intensified, and she felt her core burning. Her head felt like exploding. The feeling was impossible to endure and finally, Hinata lost consciousness. The dream slowly dissolved. It was before sunrise when Hinata woke up, covered in a cold sweat. Slowly, she sat up in her bed. Her nightmare felt too real. What happened to me? What was this all about? Why do I keep dreaming of Neji? She wasn't sure whether the dreams weren't torture instead of pain release. It hurt her to see him alive. Every time she would wake up, she would need to tell herself that this was only a dream. Neji was still dead. Hinata lowered her head and covered her face in her hands. He's dead. Gone. Stop it. She's sleeping. I need to see her right now. At that moment, Hinata heard two voices outside of her bedroom. Kiba, calm down. I bet she's still sleeping. Hanabi's annoyed tone was audible through the door. The sound of a knock on Hinata's bedroom door broke the silence. Why yes. Using the sleeve of her pajamas, Hinata quickly wiped away the sweat from her forehead. Kiba stormed into her room. Hinata, are you alright? His eyes looked concerned, and a frown covered his face. He stopped in front of her bed and leaned down to look at her. His hands squeezed her shoulders. His determined gaze scanned her face. Akamaru stood next to him and put his furry head into Hinata's lap. Oh, good morning. Yeah, I'm fine. Stroking Akamaru's head in her lap, Hinata smiled a bit wearily at her friend. I was just sleeping. To prove her point, she covered her mouth and yawned. See. Hanabi raised her eyebrow and turned to Kiba. Seriously, what is your problem? Explain yourself. Well, he stopped when Hinata shook her head slightly behind Hanabi's back. Kiba cleared his throat. I just had a strange feeling and got a little worried. So, I wanted to check up on her. Didn't know you were some kind of censor, Hanabi grunted, narrowing her eyes. But as we see here, you're rather a bad one. She's fine. Next time, don't wake everybody up again over nothing. The war is over. Everything is fine. After Kiba glanced at Hinata and then at Hanabi, he lowered his head. Yeah, guess I better get going. Just as he was about to turn around, Hinata held onto his sleeve. Thanks for looking out for me, Kiba. His eyes searched her face, looking for cues for something. After a while, his hand softly patted her head. Sure. See ya later. Smiling at him, Hinata nodded. See you later. After Kiba and Akamaru left the room, Hanabi stood there for some time, not moving. Is everything really fine? A certain concern was still on her face. Sister. I'm fine. Hinata smiled at her younger sister, trying to convince her. Sure, she was having strange dreams about Neji and heard his vicious younger self, but was it really that surprising? Let's try to sleep, right? Okay. Lowering her eyes, Hanabi turned around and walked out her door. She closed the door behind her and Hinata was left alone in her room. Hanabi, you miss him too, don't you? Hinata swallowed and closed her eyes. Next week was the memorial ceremony for the people who had died in the war. The day was straining again. This time the voice was back and repeated his taunts periodically. Forfeit Hinata. Additionally, a painful headache tortured Hinata that day. While she was in the hospital, she forced a fake smile on her lips to act normal. Loser. When would this end? In the evening, Hinata lay in her bed, tired and weakened. The days seemed to be gray and awfully long. She wished just to go back to sleep and stay there. The following dream Hinata had was a little different from the other one. Neji was sitting on a dark stone floor, some scrolls laid around him, one was in his hands. The large room looked a little different from the standard rooms in the Hyuga compound. Some shelves appeared to be standing in the room but it was too dark to see clearly. Hinata didn't recognize where they were. It looked familiar, but all rooms in the compound were similar in a way. Darkness filled most of the room that appeared to have no windows. Only a small candle on the floor beside Neji provided some light. Hinata stood next to her cousin and observed him reading. Looking very concentrated, he was quickly skimmed through a thick scroll. From time to time, he activated his Byakugan and looked around the room. The scroll in his hands appeared important, a bit yellowed but their clan emblem flashed brightly on its back. What are you reading? Hinata asked aloud and startled Neji, who had been completely lost in that scroll. Ah, it's you again, Hinata, he finally whispered, lifting his head. His light eyes focused on hers. Hinata thought to see a glimpse of a smile on his face. Sure, who else? A small giggle escaped her. She stopped when he scanned the room once again. But nobody was around them. What are you reading? He lowered his head again to look at the scroll in his hands. I don't have the time right now. I need to focus. Hinata smiled a little and sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall behind her. I make time to meet you here in my dream, and this is all I get. For a moment, Neji remained silent. Hinata, you better rest in your sleep instead of thinking about your dead relatives. That hurt. Escaping reality is even more complicated if the person you're missing tells you he's dead. Sighing deeply, Hinata pulled her arms around her legs, leaning her head on her knees and closing her watery eyes. Still, she enjoyed the dreams in which Neji was alive again, even if it would hurt her even more later when she would wake up in the morning. Her lips pressed together as she listened to Neji scrolling through the papers. Suddenly, she heard him stopping his motion and sighing. I'm sorry, Neji. Hinata opened her eyes and looked at him in surprise. His eyes were softer than usual and she saw a tiny smirk when he caught her glance. A small smile appeared on her face again. It's okay. Neji closed his scroll, sat up, and crawled on his knees towards her. Then, he sat right next to her, also leaning his back against the wall. Her smile broadened. Neji nodded and concentrated on reading the scroll again. Hinata leaned her head on his arm and just watched him reading. The dream was painful in a way, making her feel like Neji was really there even though she knew he never possibly could. As the dream started to fade slowly and Hinata woke up, she felt more tired than before sleeping. But spending time with Neji, even if it was only in her dream, felt worth it. Lying on her back, Hinata smiled a little bit. She slowly blinked at the ceiling. It was still night since no light fell into her room. She wasn't really awake yet, feeling like she was half conscious. It was a strange state between being asleep and awake. Suddenly, she felt a heavy weight on her chest. An eerie chuckle filled the room. Hey! Hinata wanted to turn her head, but then she saw him. The face of the little Neji from the Chunin exams appeared in front of her face, smirking cruelly at her. Hey loser, the little Neji hissed quietly. Ready to forfeit. Just now, she noticed that little Neji from the Chunin exams was sitting on her chest, knees pressed to her shoulders. His cold and dry hand snapped to her mouth, covering it. Hinata's eyes widened in shock. She tried to scream but couldn't. His other hand grabbed her neck, squeezing it tightly. Another sinister chuckle echoed in her head. No air, Hinata thought, panting in panic. She was suffocating. Desperately, her right hand moved to the side of her bed, reaching for the kunai on her nightstand. Abruptly, she felt his knee pinning her chest down, releasing her neck. She gasped for air as he grabbed the kunai she had tried to reach. Looking for this, little Neji brought the kunai close to her cheek. Gently, he pressed the wide side of the cold kunai on her cheek. His weight was still pressing on her chest, his face was close to hers, and she saw him clearly. He was so close she could feel his ice-cold breath on her face. His knees pressed her shoulders down, capturing her. In the darkness of the room, his light eyes shimmered like two moon-like discs. He looked merciless. Hinata concentrated chakra into her right hand and got ready to hit him. Don't even try. Doesn't work on me. He snickered as she drew her fist into his body. It didn't do anything. Little Neji didn't even flinch. Told you. Hinata watched in horror as he moved the kunai in his hand to her neck. The tears started streaming down her face. He let the kunai touch her skin without cutting it. Neji. Hinata thought about her cousin in her dream. This is another Neji. It's an awful memory. Just a memory. But why is it so real? She gripped his hand with the kunai and succeeded in snatching it from him. His creepy smirk broadened. Instantly, he jerked his head forward and smashed it into her face. The pain in her head made her fall into the cushion again. He snapped the kunai out of her hand and threw it away. Then, he grabbed her neck again, squeezing it tightly. His fingers pressed into her skin, causing her to silently cry out in pain. You're weak. I can hurt you. Forfeit. One chance left to forfeit. Again, Hinata aimed to scream, but only a muffled sound escaped. It got harder and harder to breathe. She was staring into his vicious eyes, cold and full of hatred, as she slowly drifted into darkness. You're too weak. Told you so. It was the last thing she heard. Chapter 3 My perfect enemy. The fire in front of him smoldered weakly as Sasuke opened his eyes. It was still before dawn, and the darkness was surrounding him. His head lay on his backpack on the hard ground in the woods. The phantom pain of his missing arm greeted him cheerfully like every morning. He couldn't get quite used to it yet. Damn, Sasuke mumbled as he sat up. Looking down on his filthy clothes, he sighed. After the war, he had asked to atone for his sins, and Kakashi had granted his wish. All the stops were useless. So now, Sasuke was atoning, traveling around alone. Whatever that would mean. Nobody had asked for his plan. It seemed that everybody was just glad he had left the village without any further claims. He stood up and swung his bag around his body. Then, he leaned down and picked up his sword from the ground. This leads nowhere. Step by step, he continued walking deeper into the woods. His fingers wiped some dust and dirt from his cheek. Rolling his eyes, he looked at the dirt on his fingers. I'll wash myself later. When Hinata hesitantly opened her eyes some hours later, she still remembered every second of the night. The good dream and the nightmarish vision after it. Slowly sitting up in her bed, she noticed the pain in her neck and in her head. At least the brightness of the day showed no ghosts in her bedroom this time. She stood up and opened the window to let in some fresh air. The trees outside her windows had already lost almost all their leaves. Hinata walked away from the window to her wardrobe. As she glanced into the mirror, her mouth dropped in horror. The reflection displayed dark blue spots on her neck. It wasn't just a nightmare. This is very real. Clearly, Hinata needed to find a way out of this misery. Hearing little Neji was one thing, but seeing him and being attacked was another level. She winced as she touched her forehead. Being haunted by her memories couldn't be the way she would live her life. And the spots on her neck showed that if she didn't solve the issue, her life was at stake. What could I do? Hinata wondered as her fingers stroked the sensitive skin with the blue spots on her neck. To cover up the marks, she bound her headband around her neck. But she acknowledged the fact that she needed to do something. Next time he might really kill me. How can I fight an enemy inside my mind? Hinata's physical attacks didn't help last night, whereas the little Neji was able to hurt her physically. She needed to consult a professional on human minds. Luckily, there was somebody who might help. It was still early as some warm sun rays fell on Akamaru's wet snout. Sitting at his desk in his room, Kiba scribbled something on a piece of paper. His teeth bit his tongue as he was concentrating on writing. Meanwhile, Shino's bugs were crawling over his hands, causing him to shiver. Damn it, could you stop doing that? It's tickling. And not in a good way, Kiba groaned in annoyance. Akamaru growled quietly. Yeah, Akamaru, exactly. I totally feel ya. Kiba rolled his eyes when Shino's bugs finally crawled down on the paper and slowly started leaving through the window. Better hurry up, you tiny monsters. Quickly, Hinata left her home and walked to the Yamanaka compound. The pain in her neck was pulsating with every step she took. Luckily, she spotted two women, a blonde and a pink-haired one sitting on a bench in front of the compound. Yellow flowers grew around the gateway. Sakura and Ino sat on a bench below a beautiful rose arch. Ino was wearing black since they would all attend the memorial ceremony for the war victims in the afternoon. Sakura wore her usual light pink clothes and would probably change before the ceremony. The two waved at Hinata as soon as they recognized her. Ino smiled at her. Hi, Hinata. Ino. Perfect. Hinata felt relief washing over her. Maybe Ino could help her with the strange voice inside her head. However, Hinata needed to be careful. Otherwise, her friends might think she's losing her mind. Forcing a smile to cover up the stinging pain from last night, Hinata greeted her two friends. Hello, Ino. Hello, Sakura. They all smiled warily at each other, all three looking tired. The aftermath of the war was still affecting them. Hinata sat down next to them. Ino, I went to the meadow you recommended to me. It was beautiful, thank you for the tip. Oh, really? Ino asked quietly, glancing at Hinata. Did you find some wildflowers? Hinata nodded eagerly. Better not tell Ino that she almost fell off the cliff when she went there. I did. Your botanic knowledge is incredible, Hinata said, beaming at the blonde. She admired Ino, a strong and fearless ninja who also had a softer side only a few people knew. How are you today? Sakura and Ino exchanged a glance. A curtain of sadness dimmed Ino's turquoise eyes. Her father had also died in the war, and grief was visible on her face. The death of her father made Ino head of the Yamanaka clan. As Hinata tapped on her headband, her neck felt every little traction. Now was the chance to ask questions. Ino was an expert on the mind-body jutsu and could even enter the mind of enemies and control their bodies. There was a silence Hinata finally decided to break. I wondered, she turned to Ino, about your mind-body jutsu. If you're inside a person's mind, what do you see? What does it look like? A glance of curiosity flickered in Sakura's eyes. Her lips formed a small smile. I've always asked myself the same question. What's it like? Oh, Ino's eyes widened. She put her hand on her chin and cocked her head. Well, it's difficult to describe. Everybody's mind is a little different. Ah, come on. Tell us more about it, Sakura said with a curious glimmer in her green eyes. What do you see? When I'm inside of somebody's mind, I have a look around first. Usually, I see various things. Sakura tilted her head in expectation. For example, okay, I'll try to explain it, Ino said and tapped Sakura's forehead. So, for example, in Sakura's mind, I saw her family house. It seemed to be an important place for her, a kind of a safe space. You can see things or people inside of people's minds. As for Sakura, I met the inner Sakura. You should know that Sakura has a pretty strong subconscious, and the inner Sakura is the personification of her subconscious. Subconscious. Hinata repeated, trying to sound casual. That's the part of the mind you cannot consciously access. It's something which operates, well, without you being aware of it. A slight cheeky grin flashed on Ino's lips. In Sakura's case, it protects her and even speaks to her. Right, Sakura. Yeah. With a soft smile appearing on her face, Sakura nodded her head. I hear her often. Her. Hinata's eyes widened. You hear her? MHH, yeah, I do. She helps me in difficult times and encourages me to be stronger, Sakura explained, her fingers playing with some strands of her pink hair. Then, she stuck out her tongue at her blonde friend. And I'm pretty sure she saved me when Ino attacked me with her mind jutsu in the Chunin exams. This was years ago. Come on, forehead, don't sulk. Ino burst out laughing. Sakura just rolled her eyes while Hinata giggled softly. Yeah, so the inner Sakura protected her from me intruding her mind. Ino smiled at Hinata. We all have a subconscious. It might be that you hear yours from time to time. Hinata touched her aching forehead. Is the little Neji my subconscious? She wondered. In contrast to the inner Sakura, the little Neji didn't seem to be eager to protect Hinata. The spots behind the fabric on her neck itched. Mine is pretty feisty sometimes. Sakura chuckled. But I see her as a friend, you know. She's part of me. A small smile flashed on Ino's lips. Usually, the subconscious is helping and protecting our psyche and sanity. It acts as a survival mechanism. Usually, Hinata whispered, clenching her fists. Survival mechanism. In most cases. There are, Ino lowered her eyes, lost in thought, exceptions. Hinata stared at Ino. Exceptions. Sure, there's an exception to everything. Ino's facial expression darkened for some reason. There are a few cases where the subconscious is well, hostile. Sakura and Hinata glanced at Ino. Hostile? They whispered simultaneously. Yes, it's possible. Ino let her fingers slide through her blonde hair. Never saw it myself, though. She shrugged her shoulders. My father told me about it once. I think he read about it somewhere. I think it's more of a secret knowledge and extremely uncommon. Ino's face scrunched up as she spoke about her father. Silently, Hinata put her hand on Ino's shoulder and softly squeezed it. Ino closed her eyes and breathed in and out. The three sat in silence for some time, each one lost in their minds. When you use your mind-body jutsu, do you meet the subconscious? Hinata asked, now folding her hands nervously in her lap. It was essential to be careful with the questions, and she knew that. Sakura and Ino might become suspicious. Yes, I do, Ino answered. To get control over the body, I need to switch it off. What ya mean, switch it off? Sakura tilted her head, knitting her eyebrows together. Like knock it out. It's pretty difficult to explain, Ino said. It's not comparable with our physical world. I can't really describe it. It differs from person to person. Could you destroy it? Hinata's voice was almost a whisper. Destroy. Like killing it. Ino looked at her with wide eyes. I don't know, actually. I'm not sure that would be possible. Why would you do that? I'm just curious. Hinata put her hands up and laughed hesitantly. Because you said sometimes they might be hostile. Ino placed her hand on her chin, not turning her eyes away from Hinata. I don't really think you could do anything about it. In most cases, somebody with a malicious inner self dies because of it. Hinata's eyes widened. No. Die. Sakura narrowed her eyes. Why? Yeah, if the subconscious is hostile, it will find a way to kill the host. Ino lowered her eyes. Hinata swallowed. So it will kill the host. He will kill me. Sakura pursed her lips. Kill the host. Is there no way to prevent it? A therapy. I don't think there's anything to prevent that. Ino shook her head. Hinata's lip twitched. This couldn't be true. And nothing. Our subconscious isn't the same thing as our feelings. I can't alter them, Ino said. Oh, I see, Hinata muttered. Ino carefully observed Hinata's facial expression. Why do you ask? Is it because of Neji? Hinata gulped and lowered her eyes. I know how you feel. The mind jutsu can't alter feelings, but if you want to, I can have a look into your inner self, Hinata. Ino formed a circle with her fingers focusing directly between Hinata's eyes. Maybe I can tell you more about your safe space and your subconscious then. At first, Hinata wasn't sure how to react to the offer, but then she decided to give it a try. Oka, hold on. Sakura gripped Ino's hand and frowned at her. You'd better tell Hinata first that afterward, she'll never dream again. Never dream again. Hinata's meek voice was almost not audible. An embarrassed grin plastered Ino's face. Yeah, Well, I never had one dream again, Ino pig. And it's all your fault. Sakura frowned at Ino. I want my dreams back. Ino chuckled softly. Ah, come on. Can't be that bad. No dreams, Hinata repeated. Her hand was shaking slightly. Forever. It was necessary for her to clarify. Ino had said she couldn't do anything about a hostile subconscious. And no dreams ever again. Would this be worth it? Neji. Ino shrugged her shoulders. Dreams are a pretty complicated field. The mind jutsu can disturb the dreaming processes. But it depends, it's kind of a 20 to 80 chance. A desperate sigh escaped Sakura. I really miss dreaming. I want my dreams back, Ino pig. Ano's smile faded, and she didn't react to Sakura's teasing. I'm sorry, Sakura. I'm afraid I can't do anything about it. Putting on a stern face, Ino lowered her head. I'm very sorry. Sakura looked at her with wide eyes. Damn, she whispered. Not fair. Ino put her hand on Sakura's shoulder. Hinata clenched her jaw. Never see Neji in her dreams again. It didn't feel right for her to come to a decision right now. I better get home and change. Thank you for the talk. See you later at the ceremony. Yeah, see you, Hinata, Sakura answered, and Ino nodded silently. After standing up from the bench, Hinata quickly left the two sitting underneath the roses. In the afternoon, they would all come together to mourn the fallen people from Konoha. As Hinata walked back to her compound, she was pondering. No dreams and no possibility to kill her vicious subconscious. The day got even better for Hinata since little Neji's voice started to torment her by taunting her again. He changed from earlier. His taunts became even more complex, not only a memory anymore. It seemed that he had evolved. She could see him the other night, and his insults were getting more precise. Hey, no possibility to get rid of me. Forfeit, weak loser. Hinata sighed in despair. No possibility, it can't be. I need to find a way out. She picked up her pace to walk home and change for the ceremony. Did I change? The memorial service was performed at the cemetery of the village. It was a large field with graves and memorials surrounded by grass and some thin trees. Dressed all in black, Hinata stood in one of the first rows. A certain numbness protected her from the inside. She let her eyes wander through the crowd of people in front of her. All the other Konoha villagers were standing around her, struggling through the ceremony. They had all lost loved ones, comrades, friends. Hinata turned her head to the right and saw Ino and Shikamaru also standing in the front row. Both had a shadow hanging over their faces. Shikamaru's eyes were half-dimmed, and a small frown was on his face. In contrast to Shikamaru's almost neutral facial expression, Ino's eyes were open, and one tear appeared pinned to her cheek since it didn't stop streaming. When wars happen, people die. A known fact for every shinobi. Still, it hurt them all. When wars happen, people die, and Hinata had trouble accepting this fact for one reason. Neji died for me. The warm sun rays felt cold on her pale skin, and an uncomfortable shiver traveling up and down her body wouldn't vanish. The ceremony ended after some hours. Silently, all the people around Hinata left the place. She didn't notice it. Time stood still for her. For an instant, she felt Naruto's firm and warm hand on her shoulder. She looked up to him and watched his guilty eyes avoiding hers. I know you're suffering too, Naruto, was what she would have liked to tell him, but that day didn't provide her with the strength to do it. They were both keeping their distance after Neji's death. Speaking was too painful. Hinata just stood there and tried to disappear. Her body felt like a facade to cover her weakness to protect her loved ones. He was right, I am weak, she thought bitterly. The wind picked up her hair and stung into her swollen eyes. She bit on her dry lip and looked up to the now cloudy sky. After some time, she walked to the training ground. Are you really with me, Neji? Hinata just stood on the training ground again, thinking of her cousin. How they had trained together. Neji had put a lot of time into practicing with her to get stronger. And then she wasn't strong enough to protect Naruto on her own. After a while, Hinata lost track of time. How many hours have passed? No one was around her. Still, the loneliness did her good because it made her feel disconnected from the world. It was a short moment of tranquility and peace. Hey! Suddenly, Hinata spotted the little Neji sitting on top of a wooden pole, some meters apart from her. A vicious sneer crossed his face. He looked down at her, right into her eyes. Missing me? I'm here. No need to miss me. His creepy voice inside was sending cold shivers over Hinata's skin. She felt the spots where he had pressed his fingers into her neck pulsating painfully. As soon as she recognized him, she turned around and ran. She sprinted as fast as through the village. No need to run. You can't run. He snickered. She ran through the streets, and he appeared within the crowds of people. One time, she stopped and spotted him sitting on a roof, looking down at her. No need to miss me, Hinata. The little Neji was casually sitting on the roof, long brown hair waving in the wind, vicious eyes staring right into her face. Hinata continued to race. At one point, she ran past Naruto walking on the street. Hinata. Naruto raised his head. His mouth formed a thin line, and he frowned. Wah. But she was already gone, running away as fast as possible. Hinata sprinted back to the cemetery. The sun was already setting, and nobody was on the grass any longer. Hinata just sat by Neji's grave and closed her eyes. Maybe the little Neji wouldn't bother her on his grave. Luckily, he stayed silent. As she was afraid to see him again, she continued to sit by the grave. Meanwhile, Kiba was walking home with Akamaru when he noticed Hinata's sister Hanabi sitting at the front gate of his compound. Hanabi. Kiba raised his eyebrow and picked up the pace to walk over to her. What's wrong? Is something with Hina? Yeah, you were right. Something about her is off. Hanabi's concerned frown made Kiba's heart beat faster. The last days were strange. Strange. I mean, she's grieving, so. Kiba lowered his eyes. He couldn't snitch on his friends, he had promised her to keep the strange incident on the cliff secret. Hanabi interrupted him sharply. I'm not talking about that. I think she's having some kind of trauma. Trauma. Yeah, of course, she's traumatized. Kiba exclaimed angrily. Neji died in front of her eyes. Yes, but she is acting very strange. With cautious eyes, Kiba watched Hanabi closely. What do you mean? I find her in the strangest places. In the garden, training in the middle of the night, in Neji's bedroom. Neji's bedroom. Kiba repeated slowly. Makes sense, she is grieving. Hanabi groaned. It's not only that. Sometimes when I find her, she's disoriented and confused. And on other occasions, she's different. As if she isn't herself. Yeah, still. Kiba shrugged his shoulders. Doesn't sound too strange to me. Hanabi frowned deeply inside. One night, I saw her leaving the Hyuga archives. In the archives. So, why would she be in the archives? To read some good night story. Kiba showed a toothy grin. Akamaru yapped happily to support him. Leaning down to Akamaru, Kiba stroked the hound's fluffy ears. Without even acknowledging Kiba's joke, Hanabi grimly shook her head. We never go to the archives. It's a place we were shown once or twice. It's a sacred place, and it should have been guarded. Wasn't it guarded? Kiba threw her a questioning glance. It had been, but apparently, the guard fell asleep that night. Hanabi's mouth formed a thin line, and it demonstrated two things. First, Hanabi was concerned. Second, she couldn't explain why a Hyuga guard would fall asleep during duty. Fell asleep, huh? Now Kiba put his hand to his face, thinking hard about it. What was Hinata doing there? I couldn't find out what she did. Hanabi bit her lower lip. She was very fast in her bed again. When I approached her, she seemed disoriented as if she was really asleep. Slowly Kiba nodded his head. So maybe she's sleepwalking. Yes. A frown covered Hanabi's face, and she commanded, I want you to look after her. I will. A surprised look appeared on Hanabi's face. Now this was easy. Too easy. Is there something I need to know? Kiba gulped. Her Byakugan was activated now, observing his chakra flow and his movements. No lie would go undetected. No, nothing. He shrugged his shoulders, trying to look casual. Thankfully, he had learned to deal with a Byakugan user while training with Hinata in the past. Still, knowing the capacities of the Byakugan sent a shiver down his spine. Finally, Hanabi nodded, and a small winning smile flashed on her lips. Thanks. Turning around, she left Kiba and Akamaru standing there. HMPH, yeah. Kiba pondered on everything. Knowing Hinata was suffering after Neji's death, he and Shino had tried to help her by meeting up and trying to disturb her thoughts. But comforting your friends wasn't an easy task. Kiba would have done anything to keep his teammate safe, so watching her for a while would be alright. It was already dark when Hinata still sat at Neji's grave, focusing her glance on the stone. Little Neji's aura was around her but he remained silent. Hinata clenched her fists. He's gone. This is just my imagination. After some time, her eyes started to become heavier. Sleep slowly took her in as she stared at Neji's gravestone. Resisting the painful wish for rest became harder and harder. She wondered if little Neji stood behind her. Was he watching her? Chapter 4 You're never all alone. Some hours later, Hinata woke up in her bed. With a loud yawn, she sat up, trying to remember her way back home. It seemed like her exhaustion made her forgetful since she just couldn't remember how she got back home. Maybe she had been too tired back then. As she stood up, she noticed that she was still wearing her black clothes for the ceremony. Standing in front of the mirror, Hinata carefully observed her reflection. The young woman she saw in the mirror looked pitiful. The skin on her cheeks was dry and reddened. Her eyes were swollen, and her lips appeared bloodless. At least the vicious voice inside her head was silent. She felt relieved but very tired. Exhausted and mentally worn out. What a day. So that was the memorial ceremony. Now it's official. He's gone. As those thoughts crossed her mind, her lower lip trembled. Carefully, she removed the black lacy piece of fabric from her neck that she had used to cover her dark spots. Her index finger once again stroked the aching dark spots. The marks would stay there for some time. Still looking in the mirror, she quickly wiped away the last traces of smeared tears from her face. A sudden sound startled her completely and made her mouth drop open in shock. Hinata, where are these wounds from? A strangely familiar voice suddenly rang in her ear. No, it can't be. No, it can't be. Again, she started hearing a voice. However, it sounded different from the little Neji's voice. Was she now hearing two different voices during the daytime? Who is it? She whispered into the void, looking around the room. But her eyes couldn't find anybody. It was just her imagination. In an attempt to clear her mind, Hinata shook her head. Then, she continued to undress. Her fingers slowly unbuttoned her dress. It had been a difficult day for her. A difficult week, a defeat. You hear a voice, and you're not even going to activate your Byakugan. HMPH, the voice mocked her. Hinata stopped in her tracks, and panic took over as she looked around again. The veins around her eyes shone through her skin as she activated her dojutsu. But nobody was around her, her Byakugan exposed nobody in the room. It was only a voice. But it sounded surreal. I need to speak to Ino again. Maybe she needs to look into my mind after all. Hinata sighed and nervously played with a strand of her hair. At least you tried it with your Byakugan this time. The arrogant tone showed the voice's amusement. Hinata froze. Her eyes widened in horror. She knew that voice too well. It sounded just like her cousin Neji. It was his voice. A lower voice, calmer, and more mature. This time, the voice wasn't from the little Neji. It didn't sound like a repeating memory. It was different. Now I'm really turning insane. A feeling of fainting threatened to take over her, but it didn't. Instead, her eyes wandered around in despair. She started to doubt herself and her senses. No, you're not insane. Now, tell me what happened to your neck, Neji's voice said again, sounding slightly annoyed now. Neji, Hinata stammered nervously. Is it, really, why you? Her breathing was turning into an anxious panting. The voice was different from the young voice from her memory. And it was too much pain from the past day, too much torture physically and mentally. Hinata gasped for air, breathing way too hysterically. Don't do that. Breathe, Hinata. Neji commanded. Yes, it's me. Stop suffocating. This can't be. Hinata, calm down. Neji groaned in her ear. The voice felt too real, and nausea started to hit Hinata, making her feel like vomiting on the floor. Her panting was getting worse, and she was on the edge of hyperventilating. Pull yourself together, Hinata. Hearing Neji's voice repeating that in her head didn't help. Hinata went down on her knees and lowered her head until her forehead touched the wooden floor. It felt firm and almost warm on her skin. In a desperate attempt to concentrate on the reality, she placed her hands on the floor and pushed her trembling fingers into the material. Her breathing was out of control. Concentrate, and it will go away. Listen. Neji's voice pleaded again. This time it sounded a little bit softer, almost concerned. Breathe. But Hinata couldn't focus anymore because her pounding heartbeat drowned all noise around her. It got too loud. She lay down on the floor, covering her ears with her hands. Stop, please. Hinata breathed in and out, in and out, in and out. Some long minutes passed until her heartbeat sounds got quieter, and slower. Finally, after some more minutes, she was calm enough to raise her head and look around slowly, all clear. This is only my imagination. I need to calm down. Sighing deeply, Hinata sat up and tried to make sense of it, recalling that people can suffer from hallucinations or hearing voices after a traumatic experience. And watching her cousin dying right in front of her was a case that might fit right into this category. Nobody was in the room. The sun had started to set, covering her bedroom in a golden color. It was autumn and still warm for the last days of October. The leaves had begun to fall from the trees, and the days were getting shorter. Sluggishly, Hinata moved to her feet. Then, after taking another look around her room, she sat down on her bed when suddenly Neji spoke again. finally calmed down. It was about time. I doubt Hanabi would take so long to accept it. Neji mocked her again. Hinata's tired eyes were wide open as she clenched her fists. Neji. Her stuttering was gone. The time has come to finally give up on rejecting the fact that she heard Neji in her head. She had accepted to hear and see little Neji. Somehow it made sense if she saw and heard the Neji from her dream. Yes, it's me, Hinata. I'm turning insane, Hinata whispered, trying to stop her hand from shaking. It seemed that now she heard two voices inside her head. Two voices. Two Nejis. No, you're not. I am here, Neji repeated. Now, listen. Staring at some trees in front of him, Shino stood still as his bugs on his arm swarmed around him. Rain was pouring on his head, but his coat's large hood prevented his face from getting wet. Even in the rainy weather, he wore his sunglasses. Shino nodded his head slightly at his insects, forming words in front of him on the ground. Finally, Kiba's message appeared in front of Shino. Your intuition was right. Found her on a cliff, was able to save her before she fell. Behind his dark glasses, Shino's eyebrows tightened into a frown. A cliff. Before she fell, Hinata had been standing on a cliff, and Kiba had saved her at the last minute. As future clan leader of the Aburame, Shino had visited several clan meetings in Kurigakure and Sunagakur. And while he was out of town, his friend had almost died. Unacceptable, Shino thought as he gritted his teeth. Unacceptable because he would not leave his comrades behind. More specifically, Kiba and Hinata were his friends. And he would never leave his friends behind. His bugs continued forming Kiba's words on the ground beneath him. Not sure whether she's okay now. Had strange feeling the other day. I try to keep an eye on her. But might need you. Might need you. Shino clenched his fist underneath his oversized raincoat. This didn't sound reassuring. Kiba said it in a subtle way, but Shino understood the implications. Clearly, his friends needed him. Shino looked over to his father sitting in the grass with other Aburame clan members. His finger adjusted his glasses on his nose. Still dressed in her dark clothes, Hinata was sitting on her bed, her knee shaking nervously. Her light eyes were still scanning her bedroom in confusion. Neji, are you really here? She asked quietly. A chuckling sound filled her ear. I am really here. You're not only imagining me. Hinata nodded her head slowly. Oh, okay. Good. Now answer my question. Where are these marks from? Oh. As Hinata touched the dark marks on her neck. Again, she flinched in pain. It was him. Him. The little Neji. He appeared and attacked me. He attacked you? With her fingers touching her neck, Hinata said quietly, yes, I was lying in my bed, and suddenly, he held me, and choked me. The memory of that night made her shudder. He did that. A great concern was audible in Neji's voice. These wounds are from him choking you. Yes, he appeared right in front of me, Hinata murmured. You saw him, Neji grumbled. I see. Seems like he can adapt. He must have learned it from you. From me. Hinata's eyes widened. She didn't understand anything. What could the hallucination of the little Neji possibly learn from her? What do you mean? I didn't even know it would be possible. But after I saw you. You saw me. I don't understand, Hinata said. What do you mean? Where did you see me? Remember your dreams. The dreams where we spoke with each other. Hinata nodded her head. How could she forget them? The lucid dreams had felt very realistic. In these dreams, I heard and saw you. I even felt your touch. You saw me in my dream. For you, it was a dream. For me, it was the reality. He chuckled softly. Because at that time, I was in control of your body. You were, what? Hinata exclaimed in horror. See control, my body. Yes. When you're asleep, I can move your body. I can control it whenever you're unconscious. You can control my body. Hinata repeated, fearing her own words. This had to be the end of her sanity. Yes. The other day I was able to see you while you were asleep, and I was in control of your body. I think the nasty thing inside you learned from you, and now you can see him too. Hinata just nodded her head slowly, being completely overwhelmed by all this. When she was asleep, Neji could control her body. So, the dream of Tenten. Neji interrupted her thoughts. Then, I should be able to figure out a way so you could see me here too. Do you see me now? Hinata shook her head, still confused about everything. She looked around, but nobody was in her room. No, I don't see you, Neji. Let's see how you did it. Neji went silent for some time, and Hinata was trying to keep control over her breathing. Breathe in and out, she told herself. Maybe she was just still dreaming. Suddenly, Hinata witnessed a familiar figure floating out of her own body. Neji's shape was stepping out of her body and materialized in front of her eyes. He looked just like he used to, just like the Neji who died in front of her. She saw his silhouette from behind, his long hair covered most of his back. So what about now? Neji turned around and looked right into her eyes. His face looked exactly how Hinata remembered him, pale with light eyes. It was her cousin, Neji. Her eyes looked at him in pure shock. A shiver ran down her body. Her knees were wobbly. Fortunately, she was sitting on her bed. I can see you. Neji's lips curled into a microscopic smirk. Strange to be seen again. Sasuke was walking slowly on a muddy path, his back facing a small farmer's village. A deep sigh was audible as he shook his head. I don't know what to do next, he grumbled quietly. Maybe return to Konoha and try it there. Taking a turn, he looked in another direction where his home village was located. Then, he sighed and turned away. No, he couldn't. It was not the time yet. Sasuke lowered his head and stood still. His fist tightened, and he finally put his shoulders up. Things would need to change first. Only then could he return to Konoha. The problem was Sasuke couldn't tell how to change them. He just knew that he needed to go further away from Konoha. To atone and get a clear picture of himself and everything that had happened in the last years. Meanwhile, Hinata was still sitting on her bed, looking at her cousin, seeing him clearly now. His brown silky hair framed his pale face, looking as neutral as always. How's that possible? Hinata whispered, reaching out to touch Neji. Her hand went right through him, but she felt a certain warmth. He reached out his hand, and she felt his touch on her hand. I didn't know it could be possible before I saw you do it. You figured it out intuitively. And little Neji. Yes. It seems that thing learned it from you and can also step out of you now. Out of me. She threw him a questioning look, not understanding what he was talking about. Hinata repeated with shock in her eyes, so, you're inside me. Neji shrugged his shoulders. His face was blank as always. Yes. It seems like when I died, I somehow got tied to you, but how? Hinata felt like fainting again, trying her best to stay awake. How can this be? I'm not sure myself. Impossible, Hinata whispered, touching her face with her fingers. Was she turning insane? Perhaps the stress and guilt had been too much for her to bear. She pulled her legs on her bed, crouching together, closing her eyes. This is all just a dream. This is all just a dream. As she repeated the sentence again and again in her mind, Hinata hoped to wake up from this strange dream. I will wake up, and then he's gone again. It hurt, but she wanted to accept reality. Seeing the ghost of her dead cousin could only be a psychotic episode. A hallucination. A dream. Why did reality feel like a dream to her now? When did it all get mixed up? Hey, Hinata. Neji sat down next to her, reached out, and squeezed her shoulder. When she felt his touch, her eyes snapped open again. Goosebumps appeared on her skin. He's still here. He's not gone. Staring at her deceased cousin, Hinata breathed in and out slowly to keep calm. I'm not dreaming. No, you're not. A silence filled the room. For some time, Hinata pondered on everything. She needed answers. If you were here all the time, why didn't you show yourself earlier? I tried to solve this issue on my own. But you don't sleep long enough. He shook his head first, but then a strange frown appeared on his face. Hinata thought to see a look of concern on his face. And then some things changed. First, the day you're falling down the cliff, and the other day I see you covering up choking marks. So, the day on the cliff. It was you. Hinata suddenly remembered as she looked at him with wide eyes. Faint or move, he had shouted. Neji had wanted her to get away or faint so he could move her body into safety. Yes, it was. I don't see all of it. That day I just woke up seeing you sliding right into the darkness. You woke up. Hinata repeated quietly. He gave her a nod. Sometimes I'm with you and see it all. Sometimes I'm out. When I'm out, it's like I'm pressed out by another feeling, he said quietly. Pressed out by the other Neji, Hinata concluded. He's not me. He's not another Neji. Neji exclaimed angrily, sounding offended. I know. He's part of my subconscious, most likely. Hinata couldn't help but smile a little at Neji's reaction. She still observed her cousin. Seeing Neji sitting in her bedroom was strange. Strange but also nice. He was there, with her. But why are you telling me all of this now? Neji put his hand on his chin. I decided to tell you all this because I can't let you be killed by him. Hinata's eyes focused on his eyes. He looked just like he did before he died. His long hair was hanging loosely. His light eyes seemed attentive. When he died, his eyes had become empty. Reliving the memory of it made shivers run down her spine. She rubbed her eyes and swallowed. I know it sounds impossible. I don't know exactly what happened. I assume our souls and chakra networks got connected in some way. Connected. Hinata's mouth opened and closed in disbelief. And this little Neji. Do you hear him too? I hear different things. Lots of nasty voices, repeating again and again. But I also heard myself, yes. When I hear you, however, the other voices are silent. When you don't hear me, you hear the other voices. Hinata closed her eyes to digest all the information. Yes. It tries to push us both off the edge, I suppose. Neji said. The fact that Hinata could hear the voices well made him uneasy. Would his words influence her again after all these years? What was the voice trying to achieve by trying to drag them down mentally? But why? No idea. So there are two voices of Neji I can hear in my mind, Hinata noticed silently. One was Neji himself, and the other one was the Neji from my memory. He cleared his throat and sighed deeply. At first, I thought the situation was only temporary. But it didn't change at all. And now I realized your life is in danger. That means we need to do something. Hinata nodded hesitantly. She was aware that little Neji wanted to kill her, but what could they do against it? Her cousin pulled her out of her desperate thoughts. Hey, you know, Hinata, Neji smirked a little bit, being your ghost isn't fun. She threw him a questioning glance. Your crying all the time is disturbing. His smirk had disappeared, and his eyebrows were now knitted. You do cry a lot. Hinata chuckled softly while her eyes observed him cautiously. He hadn't changed. His face looked as neutral as always, and he was just sitting in front of her. She could see him clearly. Neji is not dead. I can't touch him, but I feel his touch. And then you do strange things, like sleeping by my grave. Oh. As her cousin was mocking her again, she decided to change the subject. He was still looking at her. You said we were tied together. Yes, somehow we are connected. Connected. Hinata still stared at her cousin and couldn't help but smile. It was a strange feeling of happiness. Somehow she felt his presence inside of her. She was not alone. And he was not gone. What he had said to her in her dream was not an empty phrase. He had been by her side. He's not gone, she thought as her eyes lightened up. Her lips were still covered with her happy smile. She gulped as Neji threw her a cold glance. No, Hinata. This is not good. Sure. But her small smile wouldn't disappear. Somehow she experienced an illogical feeling of hope. Still watching her thought process, Neji rolled his eyes in annoyance. Don't even think about it. This was exactly the reason why I didn't show myself before. You don't understand. Hinata, I have no body. I am still dead. So, you're a ghost. Hinata whispered, fearful that voicing it could change it instantly, and her cousin would just disappear again. The memory of him lying dead in Naruto's arms was burned into her mind, haunting her in her nightmares. Seems like it. Neji's eyes hardened. I see through your eyes. But apart from controlling your body when you're asleep, I can't do much. And you don't sleep that much. I see all the others. Tenten, Lee, Guy. I can't do anything. I don't really exist anymore. Behind his neutral tone, Hinata recognized his desperation, even if he tried to hide it. Not being able to speak to somebody or being recognized must feel terrible, especially for Neji, who had always wanted to be in control of his own fate, his actions, his body. Hinata felt tears rising up her eyes again. But you do exist, Neji. He shrugged his shoulders. But now I have to do something. We must stop this. I won't let you die. Neji, Hinata looked at her cousin for a while. Another glimmer of hope started sparkling in her eyes. You have a plan. Neji darted a serious look at her. I do. But I can't do it without you. It's dangerous, and I couldn't risk you waking up in the midst of danger without any idea of how you got into it. Alright. First, Hinata smiled hesitantly at him, but then her characteristic bravery broke through, and her smile finally reached her eyes. What's our plan? With a little smirk, Neji nodded his head. Slowly, he walked over to the window and stopped in front of it. Hinata stood up and approached him, turning to him to see his face. His eyes wandered around in the darkness. First, we need to gather more information on this state. There should be an explanation. Yes, but how do we get it? There might be some information on it. Neji's eyebrows tightened into a frown. Since it obviously concerns your mind, one clan might have the answers. We need to break into the archives of the Yamanaka clan. First, Hinata nodded, but when she processed his words, her mouth opened in horror, and her smile crumbled. Chapter 5 Sleepwalking in the Light, B. Break into the Yamanaka clan compound. Hinata stuttered, hoping she just misheard her cousin. She was sitting on her bed, glancing at Neji standing in front of her. Unfortunately, his serious glance meant bad news. He wasn't usually the type of person to crack a joke. To ease her inner tension, she put her fingers on her temples and massaged them. Was her cousin really serious? Neji nodded his head. The Yamanaka might have something on this whole mind topic, but breaking in. Hinata mumbled. Do we really need to break in? Do you think they would give the information to you if you asked them? Neji raised his eyebrow. Hinata sighed and shook her head slowly, knowing how strictly each clan secures its secrets. Sharing the Hyuga scrolls with anyone was considered clan treason, a crime punished by the death penalty. Both Neji and Hinata knew that rule by heart. Every Hyuga knew that by heart. The two cousins looked at each other for some time, both trying to come up with a plan. For sure, the archives would be guarded. Each clan watched over their secret scrolls since they contained knowledge that only the clan members could access. There is no way to get into the archives without them noticing. Hinata wailed, and Neji snorted at her attitude. Sure, the task wouldn't be easy, but fortunately his ability to solve problems strategically and analytically has always been excellent. Of course, they would never give us their scrolls. And we would need to go there undetected. Unless, Hinata looked at him. Unless you are the Yamanaka head, Neji said with a tiny smirk. Let's see your henge. Hinata opened and closed her mouth. Transformation. This could work. Neji crossed his arms and waited for her demonstration. It felt almost like school again in a good way. If it wasn't for the fact that she might die soon and she needed to break into the archives of a noble clan. After rising from her bed, Hinata took some steps towards the mirror. Quickly, Hinata scanned her pale skin, dark hair, and light eyes. This would all need to change. Her thoughts shifted to Ino. Long, beautiful blonde hair, sparkling eyes. Hinata performed the hand symbols for the transformation. Instantly, her dark hair transformed into a blonde mane, her light eyes changed into turquoise eyes. Now she looked exactly like Ino. The transformation jutsu had always been her strength in school since her chakra control was excellent. How is it? With a hesitant smile on her face, Hinata turned to Neji and made a hand movement to focus on her appearance. Neji sighed. His frowning face made Hinata's lip twitch. It's not good enough. Neji shrugged his shoulders. We need to work on your speech and your body posture. Why? Hinata started fidgeting, pointing her fingers together. Well, Neji shook his head skeptically. On the outside, your henge is fine. But your inner demeanor doesn't fit Ino. Focus on how she acts. Alright. Hinata gave him a nod. It was almost like they were training together again. To copy how Ino looked technically wasn't a problem. But to act like Ino might be difficult since their characters were very different. The cousins continued to practice for some hours, exercising it again and again. Usually, Neji would train Hinata in taijutsu. This time he trained her to appear more confident. It was almost midnight when Neji called it a night. Humming quietly, Hinata changed into her pajamas and made herself ready for bed. Neji was sitting on the corner of the bed she lay in. As Hinata peered at him from under the covers, she beamed. Her happy smile made Neji groan. You should take the situation more seriously, he stated coldly, narrowing his eyes and tightening his eyebrows. I do, Hinata replied, her lips still curled up in joy. I'm just happy that you're here, Neji. By just analyzing his cousin's face, Neji knew her feelings and thoughts. She was an open book to him as her eyes, face, and lips said it all. To know all that wasn't always an advantage. Listen, I don't want you to be upset later when he stopped in his tracks. For the first time in a long time, he saw her smile that way. Her smile was mostly forced the past days and weeks, a smile to please others and cover up her sadness and guilt. A deep sigh escaped Neji, and he shook his head slightly. He just couldn't say it. Yes. Hinata's eyes were focused on him. Never mind. You better sleep now. Your body is weakened from the strain of the last weeks, he mumbled and stood up. He bowed politely. Still smiling, Hinata nodded slowly at first, but suddenly her face fell. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked, afraid he might be gone, and all this was just a dream, a hallucination. The expression in her eyes would have melted every iceberg, including Neji's heart, but he stayed stoic. He decided not to remind her that there was the possibility that she wakes up with the little Neji in her mind. Most certainly, yes. His answer was as rational and neutral as usual. All right. Good night, Neji, Hinata whispered and snuggled into her blanket, closing her eyes. See you tomorrow. Good night, Hinata, he replied quietly and sat down at the corner of her bed. For a while, he just sat there, guarding her as she fell asleep. The next morning was cloudy and gray. Sitting on a bench on her old school playground, Hinata spotted Kiba and Akamaru crossing the street. They were jumping through the puddles after the night's autumn rain shower. Hinata chuckled softly. It was already late in the afternoon, most of the kids were gone, and some of the older rookie ninjas gathered together. Kiba and Akamaru stopped in front of the playground. Ino was practicing taijutsu with Lee and Tenten. Shikamaru and Choji sat at another bench on the side and watched, snacking crisps from a large bag. Hinata waved at her friend. Hey Hinata, Kiba walked over to his teammate and sat next to her. Looking like a gloomy outsider again. You're lucky, I'm here for ya. A cheeky grin adorned his face. Triple A. Hello Kiba. Hinata beamed at her friend, and this time she felt how her smile reached her eyes. How are you? I'm good. What about you, how's it going? Kiba scanned Hinata's face with curiosity. I'm fine. The reason was standing right behind the bench but was invisible to Kiba. Leaning on the bench backrest, Neji carefully watched Ino's moves. You look different, Kiba mumbled. Doing better today. Hinata nodded her head slightly. Her friends knew her too well after all these years. It was almost scary how they could read her emotions. But maybe it was just too obvious that day. Awesome. Kiba's toothy grin made her giggle quietly. He patted her back with his large hand. Just awesome. I'm glad, really. We're not here for chit-chat, Hinata. Neji reminded her in a stern tone. Hinata tilted her head and concentrated on watching Ino again. Hinata and Neji had decided to observe Ino first to be able to copy each of her moves. I brought ya something. Kiba's low voice interrupted their studies. He placed a plastic bag on Hinata's knees and laughed. Her light eyes widened in surprise as she looked at the bag. For me, I thought we could use a snack. As Hinata opened the bag, she was greeted with some sweet pastries. Triple A. Cinnamon and melon buns. This sweet stuff isn't good for your body. Neji rolled his eyes at her. You don't know how difficult it is to train your body. Don't make it more difficult. Thank you so much, Kiba. Ignoring her cousin's complaints, Hinata's smile broadened as she tried to decide which bun she wanted to try first. Both looked delicious and were still warm and fresh out of the oven, so it was a difficult decision. Yup. I knew you liked them. And of course, I brought myself a snack too. Kiba pulled out another bag with beef jerky and started munching. Wanna have some? Sticking out her tongue and shaking her head, Hinata picked the melon bun and started eating. After Kiba gave Akamaru some of the meat, who also took a bite, he also bit into his snack. If Stellafius. Hinata smacked, stuffing half of the bun into her mouth. Ah Hinata, you're always eatin' like an animal. Kiba burst out laughing. Akamaru let out a happy bark. Nobody would ever believe me. Hinata's ears turned pink. She pouted while Kiba was still roaring with laughter. Her eyes wandered to her cousin for a second. Even Neji couldn't hide a little smirk. In fact, she needed to force herself to follow the etiquette while eating in the Hyuga house. Whenever she was with her friends, she would throw it out the window. Yeah, I heard that the bakery was the best in Konoha, Kiba said after finally calming down from his laughter. His eyes were attentive and focused on Hinata. You really seem different today. I foo? She asked, still munching loudly. Her light eyes swiftly shifted to Neji, knowing Kiba couldn't see him. Yeah. Kiba sighed silently. Focus on the task, Hinata. Neji frowned and poked his finger into her shoulder. Chuckling softly, Hinata once again eyed Ino, trying to memorize her body posture, her way of fighting, and talking. She and Kiba continued eating for some time. After both finished enjoying their snacks, Kiba mumbled, you know, Hanabi told me that you were sleepwalking. Sleepwalking? Neji. Hinata darted a glance at Neji, who clenched his jaw. Then, Hinata turned her head to Kiba again. You talked to Hanabi about me. Kiba gulped since Hinata threw him an uncharacteristic cold look. We met, accidentally, and well. We talked a little. I see. Do you know what you do when you sleepwalk? I really don't know. Yeah, I thought so. Kiba scratched the back of his neck. Your sister said you went to the Hyuga archives. Do you remember that? The archives. Hinata raised her eyebrows, her light eyes pierced her cousin, who just shrugged his shoulders and stayed silent. She should have concluded it from her dreams, but the last night was so overwhelming that she hadn't thought everything through. Kiba nodded. You don't remember, do ya? I had no idea, Hinata answered honestly. That's what I thought. Kiba tilted his head, patting her on her shoulder. They stayed silent for a while, and then he decided to change the topic. Yo Shikamaru, where's Naruto? Kiba shouted at Shikamaru, who was still sitting on the other bench. I searched for him today but couldn't find him. Shikamaru slowly turned his head to Kiba. Naruto is in Suna, has some future Hokage business. Sakura is with him. Ha, I see why we didn't find him. When will he come back? It will take some weeks, I guess, Shikamaru replied, shrugging his shoulders. Kiba nodded and turned to Hinata. Gotta go. My mother needs me for a negotiation with the Hokage. A negotiation? Yeah. The Inuzuka could get the main leaders of the police force. Oh, that sounds great, Kiba. A smile covered Hinata's whole face. Knowing he would be perfect for such a position, she felt excited. During the war, Kiba had voiced his wish to fill a meaningful position, the Hokage, and everybody had ignored him. Even Sasuke's announcement of becoming Hokage had received more attention back then, although he had been out of the village for years. They all knew that Naruto would become Hokage eventually, so Kiba getting the police force would be an excellent solution. You as leader of the police force would be perfect. Kiba grinned brightly. Yeah, that would be great, wouldn't it? See you soon. Yes, take care, Kiba. After he left her, Hinata turned to Neji. Her eyes narrowed. You went to the archives with my body, she whispered, putting her hand in front of her mouth so nobody would see that she was moving her lips. I needed to. His face remained neutral. What else were you doing with my body? Hinata knitted her eyebrows. Neji opened and closed his mouth before he answered, I trained, gathered information, and... What about Tenten? Hinata's eyes quickly wandered to Tenten, who was still sparring with Ino. The dream of Neji and Tenten. What does she know about this? Not much. I transformed into myself and told her I'm a ghost. Neji shrugged his shoulders. His eyes shifted to Tenten. He relaxed his eyebrows as he observed her. You told her you're a ghost, and she said nothing. Raising her eyebrow, Hinata looked at him in disbelief. She doesn't know you used my body to meet her. Neji shook his head slowly. She believes in ghosts, and she believes in me. I had to say goodbye. His eyes hardened as his fingers pressed firmly into the bench. I see. Hinata sighed and decided to drop the subject. Neji, we need to work as a team if we want to succeed. I agree. No more secrets, okay. Focusing on her cousin, Hinata tightened her eyebrows, and her Byakugan veins popped. Neji gulped. No more secrets. Hinata stood up and waved to her comrades to say goodbye. Most of them didn't notice her leaving. She was a bland person, constantly blurring into the background, and she was used to it. Who could even blame them? It was what Hinata favored anyway. Being in the spotlight would mean her family shaming her whenever she would need to present herself. She turned around and started walking home. Wait, Hinata. But this time, Ino saw her, ran to her, and stopped right in front of her. Hey, Ino. Immediately, Hinata lowered her eyes, feeling too bad about their plan of stealing the Yamanaka scrolls. It felt so wrong. Listen, Ino smiled hesitantly. I thought about our talk the other day. Okay. I know how you feel. If you want to talk, I'm here for you. Ino's hand played with a blonde strand of hair. Hinata felt as if somebody had slapped her in the face. There she was planning to break into the archives of her friend while Ino wanted to show her support. We lost somebody very important. It's a difficult time for you and me. But I hope. Ino swallowed, and Hinata saw her eyes getting a little watery. I hope it will get better. Hinata pulled her into a warm hug. Thank you, Ino. I want to be there for you too. Sure. Ino laughed and released the hug. See you tomorrow, huh? See you, Hinata whispered and started walking home. Biting her lip, she closed her eyes and sighed. Why did it all feel so wrong? Still, she couldn't tell Ino she heard voices in her head. They weren't that close and she was scared of being called insane. It's the only way, Neji said quietly. His voice sounded almost soft. I don't want you to die. If we succeed with the mission, Ino won't even notice the scrolls are gone. We'll bring them back afterward. Hinata nodded hesitantly. I hope so. On her way back home, Hinata was lost in her thoughts. Neji was also silent for a while, walking beside her. After entering her own bedroom, she sighed again and clenched her fists. So, what information did you gather? Hinata turned to her cousin. The only things I found were plans of Tenketsu networks and some scrolls about Juinjutsu. Juinjutsu, Hinata repeated, stroking her neck. Do you know something about it? Yes. As a main branch member, I was taught some basics. It's mainly seals like the caged bird. The caged bird. Neji clenched his fist. What else? They can be used for different things. I don't know if it could help us here. I don't think so either. Look here. He pointed under her bed. Hinata kneeled and found some papers under her bed. And Neji, you're just hiding this in my room. I put it in my room first, but it got even more suspicious for you to go there. You're right. After exchanging a glance with Neji, Hinata looked at the papers that depicted a plan of the human body, more specifically the part of the head and neck. That could be interesting for chakra control inside the head. Look here. Neji's finger pointed to a point on the plan, a point on the temple. This seems like one spot to infuse chakra inside the head. But we can't do anything with that. To localize the spot, Hinata put her finger on her temple and looked at the map again. What would happen if somebody activates the point? It doesn't mean anything. I tried to trigger this point, but the only thing that happened was I passed out. Neji frowned, and Hinata smiled a little bit. When she realized he had passed out with her body, her smile faded. We need to act tonight, Hinata. I am still here, and we need to do it while he isn't with you. You're right. We'll do it tonight. With Neji by her side, she believed there was a chance to complete this difficult task. A very challenging mission. But Hinata's life was at stake, so there seemed not much of another chance. The cousins got ready. It would all happen that night. Byakugan. Hinata's hands shook slightly as she appeared on the roof of the house on the side of the Yamanaka compound. Sitting in a crouching position, she observed the compound. Her slender figure was almost invisible in the foggy autumn night. Her long hair was covering her shoulders and knees like a dark coat. A bag was strapped to her back. Relax, Hinata, you can do it. Neji encouraged her, sensing his cousin's insecurity. Seeing him crouching next to her helped her, even though she was the only one who could see him. Still, she didn't feel alone with this difficult task. Breaking into her friend's house wasn't Hinata's idea of a good family time with the ghost of her cousin. Still, it was the only possibility to find out more about the strange condition she found herself in. Her life was at stake, and she would rather break into an archive than die at the hands of her subconscious. Hinata scanned the compound. Similar to the Hyuga, the Yamanaka had many members. As the Hyuga could see chakra signatures, Hinata had an advantage with this sneaky mission. Still, she was alone against around 30 to 40 Yamanaka members. Luckily, most of them were sleeping right now. Dog. Boar. Ram. Swiftly, Hinata's hands performed the seals for the transformation jutsu. Instantly, her bluish hair turned into a nose blonde. Then, her light eyes recolored to a turquoise. Now, her outer appearance resembled Ino. Hinata nodded at Neji. Okay, let's do it. Her cousin returned a nod, frowning. Don't forget to pay attention to your speech and your posture. Right. Hinata pulled up her shoulders and tried to look more self-confident. Neji clenched his fists. Hopefully, she could do it. If somebody caught her, the ramifications would be severe. As we said, try to avoid speaking to anyone in the first place. Understood. Still, on the roof of the Yamanaka compound, Hinata's light eyes observed the compound. A nose in her bedroom. The archives are beneath the main building, just like ours, Neji said. Don't let them doubt you. Hinata gave him a short nod and turned right to run on the roof of the compound. Ducking to appear invisible, she sprinted as fast as she could toward the main building. When she reached a point where the main building was to her left, she jumped down and walked slowly to the building. Head up, shoulders back. Hinata remembered Neji's instructions. 2 guards were positioned in front of the door. Hinata gave them a gracious nod. They bowed back. Good, Neji said. Hinata walked to the door, trying to imitate Ino's elegant attitude. As Neji had pointed out, the archives would most probably be in the cellar. Little by little, Hinata stepped through the smaller halls of the Yamanaka main building, nodding and bowing politely at the clan members passing her way. Sometimes she gave them a small smile. They really have lots of guards here. Far more than we have, Neji commented, observing the situation carefully and walking behind Hinata. At least 6 Yamanaka members stood in the hallway with the stairways downstairs. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her. Ino, what are you doing here? Hinata turned around and saw a woman with light brown eyes and hair. Ino's mother. Stay calm, Hinata. Mother. I wanted to look for something in the archives, Hinata answered, trying to imitate Ino. But it's so late. Yes. I couldn't sleep. I see. The brown eyes focused on Hinata. Ino's mother smiled warmly at her. Sweetheart, I bought the present for your aunt. The one you wanted me to. Hinata's mouth opened and closed silently. Neji clenched his jaw. Hinata's eyes quickly shifted to him, and he shrugged his shoulders. That's great, thank you, Hinata answered and smiled back. Neji was observing the interaction carefully. There was a slight shift in the older woman's face. Good night, sweetheart. Good night, Mother. Hinata swallowed silently and tried to imitate Ino's smile. The next seconds felt like years. Then Ino's mother nodded slightly and turned around. She slowly walked up the stairs. Hurry up, Neji hissed, and Hinata quickly descended the stairs. She finally reached the cellar. The guard let her in without any further questions. Hinata smiled hesitantly as she entered the archives. It was full of shelves. She ran to the archive's main ordering scroll and skimmed through the scroll names. Neji looked over her shoulder and looked out for the information they needed. Subconscious, mind fusion, soul mind binding, chakra mind fusion. Hinata searched for the scrolls. Quickly, she put scroll after scroll in the bag over her shoulder. Almost done. Okay, we're done. Get out of here. Hinata nodded eagerly and bolted towards the exit. All of a sudden, her Byakugan spotted more than 10 people sprinting in her direction. They know we're here. Run. Neji didn't have to tell her twice. Her feet darted quickly but quietly into the stone floor as she ran through the archive's entrance and up the stairs. Still, she met one guard in the big hallway. There she is. A male voice screeched. Get the intruder. Now Hinata sprinted at the guard. As the man thrust forward his short sword, Hinata ducked gracefully and blocked the sharp blade with her kunai. After that, she pushed her gentle fist into the tiny chakra points her Byakugan showed her. 2 small pokes were necessary. 1, 2. He fell to the stone floor. Sorry, she whispered to the unconscious guard. The guilt of breaking into the house of a friend and knocking out the guards wasn't easy to bear for her. Did you really just apologize? Neji raised his eyebrow in disbelief, but Hinata wasn't paying attention to him because a group of 9 tall men circled her. Hinata started her attack. 8 trigrams 64 palms. Quickly, her arms darted hits around her body, targeting each of her attack's invisible tenketsu points. She knocked them out, but more guards behind them kept coming after her. It was too late. They had spotted her, and the message had already spread. To stop wasting chakra, Hinata dispersed her transformation and turned back into herself. She got ready to use her defensive trigrams and stop. A familiar voice commanded. The guards and Hinata stopped in her tracks. She turned her head and recognized a frame standing on the opposite side of the hallway. Beautiful blonde hair waved to the side, and turquoise eyes searched the hallway and quickly scanned through the room, examining the situation and looking for the intruder. Hinata. The shock was written all over Ino's face as she spotted her friend. With a feeling of endless shame, Hinata lowered her eyes to escape Ino's gaze. What are you doing here? Lady Yamanaka. The Yamanaka guards turned to Ino. Should we attack? Ino was holding up her hand to signalize them to wait for her instructions. Hinata's eyes scanned the people in the room and around it. She was outnumbered. Could her gentle fist provide shelter against that many opponents? Hinata glanced at Ino, who was still trying to make sense of the situation. Hinata, what are you doing here? Ino repeated. Her voice was low and focused. Her blonde hair fell on her shoulders. She had her kunai in one hand. Hinata stood exactly at the opposite wall of the hallway. Her long bluish hair was still bouncing from her movement earlier. Determination filled her eyes. However, her mouth opened and closed again, incapable of saying something out loud. We need to get out of here, there is no other way out, Neji said, who was standing next to her. She stole scrolls from the archives, Lady Yamanaka. Another member of the clan reported as he ran from the archive. She knocked out our guards. You break into my house, attack my people, and try to steal our secrets. Why? Ino asked as a frown covered her face. Is it a command from your father? But you're alone, that can't be it. That means you're here on your own. I'm so sorry, Hinata whispered, her hands shaking slightly. Neji turned his head to his cousin. Hinata, you need to get out of here. Remember, he'll kill you otherwise. Get out of here, you can apologize later, Neji said. Hinata gave him a sideways glance and nodded slightly. Hinata, give us back our scrolls, and I will forget what happened here. Ino's turquoise eyes indicated a softness. The situation seemed to be extremely hard for her. She didn't look like she wanted to fight. However, as the Yamanaka clan head, Ino needed to act accordingly, and Hinata knew that too. I'm sorry, Ino. I can't. Please let us go, Hinata exclaimed. Her voice was loud but shaking. Ino's frown deepened. Hinata, you leave me no other choice. I say it one last time. Put down the scrolls, and I'll let you go. I can't. Hinata bit her lower lip. There was no other possibility. She needed the information. I'm very sorry. Please. I don't want to hurt you. Ino took a step towards Hinata. Tiny tears were sitting in Ino's eyes, her frown kept them in place. She stayed alert. Her emotions wouldn't compromise her responsibility as the clan head. Hinata said, I don't want to fight you. Please just let us go. Her Byakugan was still activated, and she stood in her fighting stance. There was no way back. I can't. Ano's voice was trembling with emotion for a second. She closed her eyes for a second and breathed in. Damn, Hinata. You leave me no other choice. A silence filled the room as all eyes were on Hinata and Ino. The guards were waiting for Ano's instructions, and Hinata thought of ways to escape. Ano's eyes snapped open again, flickering with determination. It was too late. The attempts at negotiation led nowhere. Finally, Ino instructed her guards. Get her. Instantly, the Yamanaka guards stormed towards Hinata, forming a circle around her and closing in. Hinata had scanned the place and knew that all Yamanaka members had surrounded the hall. Alone against 40 skilled shinobi. The situation was tricky. We have 2 chances, remember. One until you get knocked out and one until I get knocked out, Neji said. Even though nobody saw him, he was in his fighting stance as well. It helped somehow as it provided her support. Or one chance if they kill me instantly, Hinata mumbled, tears rising in her eyes. Why was she there again? In the house of her friend trying to steal her family's secrets. The task seemed not as honorable as jumping in front of an enemy to save a comrade. Neji threw a sharp look at his cousin. Don't forget why you're here. You want to live, remember? He frowned and stood in front of her, looking into her eyes. Neji still could read Hinata's emotions from her eyes and stature. I know you doubt yourself, but you are capable. Right. You have to fight, Hinata. Don't forget your ninja way. Neji smirked as he recited Hinata's and Naruto's motto. I'm here. We'll do it together. Alright. Hinata nodded. Let's do our best, she whispered to her cousin. The guards started sprinting at her, and she got ready to use her gentle palms. With slow but steady steps, Shikamaru entered the Yamanaka main hall. He felt very annoyed and tired. A loud yawn escaped him. So, I heard some idiot broke into the compound, and the Yamanaka needed our help. I'd say it is a drag, but. Ino turned around to face her friend leaning on the door and gave him a grumpy nod. Good, you're here. The lights of the room let their shadow fall on Ino's face. And I just fell asleep, how tiresome, Shikamaru mumbled, rolling his eyes. He took some more steps towards Ino. So who's the unlucky bast, Hinata? Ino pursed her lips. Seems like it. Shikamaru's eyes widened. Hinata was the last person he would expect to break into the Yamanaka clan archives. I'm pretty sure they already knocked her out once, but she stood up again. It's like she's possessed, Ino explained as her eyes focused on the spar. The irritation in her voice was obvious. Knocked her out, and she got up again. Yeah, it was so strange, really. Shikamaru raised his eyebrow in astonishment. But why? I don't know what got into her, Ino said, but she doesn't seem like herself. She went completely crazy. I might have to go inside. The two observed the fight between Hinata and Ino's guards. No weapons allowed, Ino whispered. Shikamaru nodded. His eyes studied Hinata's movements. Why would she break into the Yamanaka archives? 8 trigrams palms revolving heaven. Even Hinata's voice sounded different. Low and determined as if she wasn't herself. Her palm rotation formed a defensive dome that surrounded him like a wall of chakra, pushing all the guards away and knocking lots of them out in the process. They were replaced by their comrades standing behind them. She was still outnumbered since Shikamaru brought some guards with him as well. Shikamaru put his hand to his chin, thinking about the whole situation. The Kaden. Isn't it Neji's? Ino shrugged her shoulders. Hinata, he exclaimed, and it took some time until 2 light eyes focused on him for a second. Shikamaru. The growling voice didn't sound like Hinata at all. The sound came from her mouth, though. So Hinata, what do you want here? Shikamaru asked, narrowing his eyes. Hinata was still fighting against the guards, her palms blocking the taijutsu attacks from them. We want the scrolls, and then we're gone. We don't want to hurt anybody. Shikamaru mumbled, tightening his eyebrows. Then, he asked louder, what do you need the scrolls for? To survive, came as an answer while Hinata ducked to dodge an attacker from behind. Shikamaru knew that her Byakugan saw everything. What do you mean? Shikamaru asked. You won't understand it anyway. The voice was low and controlled, no stuttering. Her palms were swirling around, performing another circle of a blockade. Every time a guard dared to step one step further, he got instantly knocked out. Shikamaru raised his thin eyebrow. Try me. No time for that. Shikamaru observed her with wide and cautious eyes. While he was never close to Hinata, he still knew her. Even her way of speaking was different. A big question mark was written over his face. Ino shook her head, bouncing her blonde locks. You see, she won't negotiate. I'll go in. Shikamaru was racking his brain. What does all of this mean? Why would Hinata break in? He gave Ino a sideways glance. Yeah, she doesn't seem like herself. Hold her, Ino commanded, and Shikamaru nodded hesitantly. In order to enter Hinata's mind, Ino needed him to prevent any movements. Otherwise, her jutsu wouldn't work. But something was off, Shikamaru felt it. Something was off. Observing the fight, Shikamaru still got ready to act. The Kaiden was a very effective technique, a dome of chakra for defense. He wasn't aware that Hinata was even familiar with this technique. He had only seen Neji using it. Still, the technique required a huge amount of chakra, and as soon as there would be a millisecond of a break to readjust. Resembling the dark wings of a bird, Shikamaru's shadows swiftly crawled over the ground until they reached Hinata's feet. First, she could escape, but the guards were also closing in, and the shadows succeeded in slipping through her defense. Shit! Hinata roared as Shikamaru's shadows held her arms and legs. A frown covered Shikamaru's face as he was still contemplating what was going on with Hinata. Ready, he mumbled, and it was Ino's turn. She leaned against Shikamaru, so she could focus on entering Hinata's mind. Her fingers formed a circle, and she pointed it at Hinata. Mind-body switch technique, Ino murmured, starting the process of transferring her mind into Hinata's body to control it. No, Hinata's eyes widened first and fell shut. Shikamaru sighed. Somehow he felt relieved. Ino would find out what was wrong with Hinata, and the problem would be solved. What a strange night. Suddenly, the lights flickered in the room, causing issues for Shikamaru's shadows to hold Hinata. Then, an eerie chuckle filled the room. The voice did not resemble Hinata even if it seemed to come out of her mouth. Hey. Shikamaru raised his eyebrow at the strange sound. What the fuck? The room felt as if the temperature had dropped some degrees. It was difficult to recognize anything because the lights were still flickering. A sudden terrifying female shriek made Shikamaru shudder. An uncomfortable shiver ran on his skin. Ino. Kiba was lying on his bed when suddenly a gloomy figure appeared in his window. A shadow covered the tall man with dark glasses, wearing an oversized coat. He nearly gave Kiba a heart attack. What the? Kiba growled. Shino. It's you. Damn. I thought my end had come. Kiba. Shino greeted him with a nod. You ask yourself why I am here. Because Hinata is in trouble. Hinata. Kiba exclaimed and jumped up from his bed. Shino nodded slightly, and they exchanged a glance. Slowly, Hinata opened her eyes and found herself glancing at her own reflection. It took her a second to realize where she was. She was standing in front of her mirror in her own bedroom in the Hyuga main building. Oh, I'm home, she thought and looked into the mirror. What is this? Her face was covered with tiny red liquid splatters resembling tiny raindrops or freckles. Her index finger slowly wandered to one drop and smeared it. She froze. Blood. Her hands shook slightly as she looked down on herself and found more blood on her hands. And Neji. There was no answer to her desperate whisper. The silence was dreadful. Hinata put her hand on her forehead because an ache was pounding through her body. What happened? The Yamanaka compound. The archives. She remembered being knocked out by the guards. Neji should have been in control after that. What happened? She was in her bedroom again. That meant that they had won the fight and had been able to flee. The weight of the scrolls in the bag across her back meant they had succeeded. Slowly she looked down on her body again. She must have been injured, but where? Her hands pressed onto her body, searching for the source of the blood. Apart from her headache, she didn't feel any pain. No pain. This isn't my blood. Hinata's eyes widened in shock. But her hands and face, she and Neji were only using gentle fists. Gentle fists usually did not draw so much blood. Wait, whose blood is this? Neji. Hinata whimpered. What happened? But again, nobody answered. She was all alone. At that very moment, her bedroom door was torn open, and Hinata jumped up. Her sister Hanabi stormed into the room. A strange mixture of emotions covered Hanabi's face. Lots of emotions. Hinata watched her in awe. What is? Sister. Hanabi eyed Hinata quickly, spotting the blood. Shit. Hanabi, why are you still here? Hanabi hissed. Staring at her sister, Hinata only opened and closed her mouth. Hinata, you need to run. Run. Why? They are searching for you. You must go. Right now. Search. Hinata, you're going to be executed. They call for instant revenge. Revenge. Hinata repeated. Her hands shook nervously. Executed. You. Hanabi's eyes focused on different points in Hinata's face. There was something in her sister's eyes Hinata couldn't read. They say you killed the Yamanaka clan head. You killed the Yamanaka clan head. The words felt like a metal rod cutting through Hinata's intestines. Kill the Yamanaka head. Kill. ... Ino. Ino. Hinata's eyes were widened in sheer terror. And no, that can't be. Gritting her teeth, Hanabi pushed her towards the window. We have no time right now. It won't even reach the Hokage. You'll be dead until then. It's a clan affair, and they want you dead, or they start a clan war. Go. No. 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 Hinata shook her head repeatedly. You don't remember, do you? Hanabi mumbled as she looked at her sister. You were sleepwalking, right? Hinata shuddered. Her legs threatened to collapse. I don't. It doesn't matter, it makes no difference. You need to go now, Hanabi snarled at her, and when she saw that her sister was just standing there, she repeated, you need to go. Hinata stuttered, panting nervously. Smack. Hanabi slapped Hinata in the face. As her cheek reddened in throbbing pain, Hinata's light eyes focused on her sister's. Hanabi's eyes were full of emotion. Anger, fear, and sadness. However, her eyebrows showed her determined frown. Hanabi's hand remained on Hinata's face for a while, tenderly holding the pulsating cheek she had just hit. The slap brought Hinata back to reality. I must leave, otherwise, she would be dead before she could even explain herself. The situation needed to cool down first. Hinata, we'll find a way. I will find a way. But for now, run. Hanabi commanded and shoved her sister towards the window. Focusing on preventing her body from shaking, Hinata nodded and climbed out of the window frame. She turned around one last time to look at Hanabi. Thank you, sister. Take care, Hanabi whispered through her trembling lips. As Hinata jumped down out of the window, the cold wind whipped against her wet cheeks. Her feet had one objective: run as fast as they could. Out of Konoha. It didn't matter where. The objective was to get out. Hinata was on the run. Chapter 6 Our moment forever sealed in time. Little but fast steps started into the ground as Hinata was sprinting out of her home village. She had no specific direction. After she passed the village gates, she continued to run straight forward, just as far away as possible. Apart from the emptiness that resided in her head, two thoughts were alternating popping up inside her mind. First, what happened to Ino? Second, where are you, Neji? She pressed through her teeth. Can you hear me? All her mental and physical strength was required to keep running. Her Byakugan showed multiple chakra signatures following her. She gritted her teeth and continued her run. Why don't you talk to me anymore? No answer. No voices. No Nejis. Had it only been her imagination after all? Had her own mind been playing tricks on her? Maybe she had just been slowly turning insane. Either way, there was no way back to her old life. Hopeless. There was no way back and nowhere to go. Guilty. Can you feel guilty for something you don't remember? Yes, you can. The guilt was growing with every step Hinata took to escape. Another hour of sprinting passed and there were still at least 5 nins following. She couldn't keep up that pace, so she decided to fight. Rapidly turning around, Hinata went into her fighting stance and waited. As soon as the 5 ninja arrived, they circled her, and she started distributing her gentle palms around herself again. But this time they were prepared and some stayed in the background and started throwing kunai and shuriken at her. It wasn't easy to dodge. Her chakra reserves were almost drained. Maybe that's the end. As that thought hit her, she couldn't help but wonder where she went wrong. Little Neji succeeded after all. His pressure resulted in another life-threatening situation. There's no hope for me. Her Byakugan saw somebody striking at her back but she couldn't counter because her arms were busy preventing the other hits in front of her. Maybe that was just the end after all. A loud noise made Hinata look up and see all the attackers lying unconscious on the floor. The responsible ninjas were standing right in front of her. One was tall, wearing a large coat and dark sunglasses even in the night. The other one had spiky brown hair and a sweet but large hound. Shino. Kiba. Wah. Hinata's eyes widened in surprise. What do you? We have to run now, Hinata. Shino's bugs buzzed nervously while he fixed his coat after his taijutsu attack. The usual neutral expression which resided on his face gave her a small taste of security. Almost like in the past, teammate was united. We'll talk later, Kiba exclaimed. Come. He and Akamaru jumped ahead, followed by Shino. But, a moment passed in which Hinata hesitated before she followed her teammates. What are they doing here? Why did they follow me? They were running for hours. The sun had risen, announcing dawn again. They were silent, nobody spoke. Hinata's thoughts were running in circles. What happened to Ino? Everything seemed like a nightmare. What did she do? What happened at the compound? There were too many open questions. She needed answers. Right now. Please wait. Hinata's shout out caused her teammates to turn around. Their glances were full of concern. Two bugs swiftly crawled over Shino's face as he cocked his head. Is everything alright? How can anything ever be alright? Please wait, she panted, leaning down and putting her hands on her knees. Her teammates finally stopped. I have to know, Kiba knitted his eyebrows. What happened to Ino? The tremble in Hinata's voice was audible. What did I do? After throwing Kiba a slight glance, Shino opened his mouth but nothing came out. Meanwhile, Kiba's face was covered by a deep frown, whereas his eyes appeared tired. You don't know? He asked slowly as his dark eyes looked right into hers. No, I don't remember. Biting hard on her lower lip helped Hinata keep control over any tears already waiting to be released. Again, Shino and Kiba exchanged a strange glance. A feeling of dread fell upon Hinata. Did her friends doubt her? It wasn't surprising. But then, she saw that Kiba's stern glance softened. As she looked at Shino, something in his facial expression hit her hard. At that very moment, she recognized something which struck her into her heart. Her friends were still trusting her. Their trust was almost torture for her since she didn't trust herself. We don't know either. There was not much information on it. But it was announced that the clan leader had been fatally injured, Shino said. His voice was calm as usual. Hearing it resulted in Hinata's blood-stained hands shaking again. Fatally injured. Guilty. I'm guilty. It's my fault. I killed her. The Hyuga disassociated from you. From your, Shino started explaining. Crimes, Hinata finished Shino's sentence in her head. Actions, Shino finished. A numb feeling threatened to paralyze Hinata, who still managed to nod absently, knowing that was the only reasonable consequence to prevent a clan war between her clan and the Yamanaka clan. Her breath picked up some pace. Ino, it can't be, what happened? How did it end up like this? Let's keep movin', Kiba suggested when Hinata was on the edge of a panic attack. He pulled her by her arm, urging her to jump after him. The three walked through the woods for some hours. They had no real direction or plan, trying to get as far away from any followers as possible. The leaves under their feet crunched as they continued walking through the woods. A thick mist rose from the ground, making it more difficult to see the trees in front of them. I guess we're all rogues now, Kiba grunted as he kicked away a stone in front of him. The glare he received from Shino made him go silent. I don't want that for you, Hinata said quietly. Kiba walked closer to her and put his hand on her shoulder. Hey, she felt his hand patting her shoulder. We stay with Ya, no matter what. What do you say, Shino? A firm nod from Shino set the deal. After taking a step towards Kiba and Hinata, he put his hands on his friend's shoulders. We'll stay together. Please go. Suddenly, Hinata's voice was determined, sounding worthy of the clan head she was born to be. I don't want this for you. You have to leave me. How could she accept that both her friends wanted to abandon their positions as clan leaders and become rogues for the crimes she had committed? Even if the crimes were not conscious. What difference did it make if the result was what counted? Surprised at Hinata's command, both Shino and Kiba looked at her. With his teeth gritted, Kiba shook his head. No, we've already chosen our path. Our path. Hinata's face fell. But it's my fault. I can't drag you into it. Why? You ask why. Behind his dark shaded glasses, Shino narrowed his eyes. Because we're more than just comrades. We won't let you do this alone. Remember, you said we protect each other. Kiba's lips turned into a toothy grin. Akamaru let out a bark of agreement. Hinata lowered her eyes and sighed, her lip trembled in emotion. Her team was like a family to her, and their support was priceless. It was far more than she deserved. More she felt she was worth. Here, Shino pulled one of his bags from his back and handed it to Hinata. We packed you some fresh clothes along with other necessities. Casting her teammates a surprised look, Hinata took the bag. For me, thank you. We should continue walking for a while. And then rest. The instructions Shino gave seemed reasonable to his teammates as they agreed with a curt nod. They continued their march through the woods. It was getting late again. There is nobody in our range, Hinata said after scanning the area with her Byakugan. Let's stop and take a break, Kiba suggested, throwing his bag on the ground. I agree. Shino looked around, letting his bugs crawl over his fingers again. The team lit a fire and prepared everything for a night's rest. Almost like in the good old times. It didn't take long until the three were sitting at the fire. Hinata's fingers shook as the warmth of the flames didn't reach her. Akamaru slowly walked around the three, sniffing around. Tell us what happened. Shino's voice was calm and controlled as always. Kiba's eyes flickered to Hinata. I don't remember, she repeated quietly. I lost my consciousness, and when I woke up, I was home. Only then I saw that I was covered in blood. She swallowed at the thought, tucking her trembling fingers under her thighs. You don't remember, Kiba said slowly. Do you remember going to the Yamanaka compound? Feeling the cautious glances of her friends on her, Hinata struggled to provide an answer. Should she tell her friends she heard two of Neji's voices? But as she looked into the tired faces of her friends, she realized that she needed to come clean. They deserved to know. They were willing to give up everything for her. Yes. I broke into the archives. Hinata looked away. I needed information. Kiba's mouth dropped while Shino's eyebrows tightened. Information. On what? Shino asked. I started to hear Neji's voice inside my head, Hinata whispered. It had started after his death. I heard things from my memory, from the Chunin exam. The Chunin exam. Shino clenched his fists under his coat. What exactly? His speech. Speech. What speech? Hinata remembered that during the fight of the Hyuga siblings, Kiba had been in the medical booth. After clearing his throat, Shino turned to the fire. Basically, Neji spoke about fate and destiny and told Hinata a couple of philosophical theories. As a result, he claimed that destiny is set and there's no free will. Kiba nodded slowly. Sounds like some bullshit the genin Neji would have said at that time. And you heard his voice in your head telling you that? Shino asked, turning to her. Yes. That I should forfeit and give up. Hinata folded her hands together and released them, then repeated the motion. That I should just give up and accept my weakness. Shino's face remained blank. What happened then? First, it was only his voice, but then, Hinata swallowed before she continued. He appeared in front of me. Attacking me. Choking me. Slowly, she untied the headband on her neck that had covered her blue spots. Their eyes widened as her friends exchanged a worried glance. Another bug crawled over Shino's eyebrow. That was him. Yes, Hinata replied quietly. Kiba tilted his head, stroking his chin absently. So that incident on the cliff. Yes, it was him. I felt drawn into the abyss. By the voice. Suddenly, Hinata was not sure if she should tell her friends about the other Neji too. Maybe it was too much for them, and they would think that she was completely insane. I spoke to Ino, and she told me that it might be my subconscious turning against me. I wanted more information, so I broke into the archives. Shino observed her through his glasses. I see. A hostile subconscious. Some minutes passed, and Hinata decided not to mention the other Neji inside her head. Especially since he didn't speak to her after their mission. Maybe he was just her imagination, and now she was a rogue without the possibility to go back home. In a way, the little Neji got what he wanted. She was only a step from being killed. Shino nodded his head slowly. I see why you did it. We should rest now. We'll need to set out early tomorrow. But, where? Hinata asked quietly. Where should we go? Silence filled the following minutes. All three appeared to think of a solution. Then Kiba shrugged his shoulders. Somewhere where they won't search for us. For us, Hinata repeated it silently in her mind. As if he sensed her feelings, she felt Shino's hand on her shoulder. It's all right, he said quietly. The usual buzzing from his bugs felt almost calming. That's not fair. Hinata responded with a smile. How could she let her team suffer for her mistakes? Also, there was another big problem which she couldn't forget. Let's decide tomorrow, she suggested. We can think of something later. Let's rest first. As usual, her team agreed with her. Taking the first night's watch, Kiba sat down near the fire. Akamaru followed him as always. Meanwhile, Shino laid his head on his backpack, crunched up, and fell asleep. Lying on the ground, Hinata pretended to sleep as well. In reality, she was pondering. Unconsciously, she had killed a comrade. How could she trust herself being around her friends? Her half-dimmed eyes wandered to Kiba sitting by the fire and then to Shino lying beside her. I can't trust myself. Shino. Kiba. What if I attack you? Even thinking about it made Hinata shudder, but she knew she needed to accept the facts. The fact that she didn't have control over her body. The fact that she had killed a friend. The fact that she couldn't trust herself. I will protect you, was what she had said to Kiba. She meant it. To protect the people she cherished, she would have done everything. Anything. A small frown appeared on her face. Her mouth formed a thin line. As she closed her eyes, she breathed in. Seated in front of the fire, Kiba absently watched the flames, letting the warmth revive his cold fingers. He felt tired. Akamaru was sleeping on his lap. His hand stroked through the hound's soft fur, and Akamaru groaned softly. Damn it. What a shitty day. Kiba sighed and let his hand rest on his forehead. Running from his home village and turning rogue wasn't what he had planned for this day. His thoughts shifted to his mother and sister. What would they think about everything? There had been negotiations to announce him as leader of the police task force. That was out of the question now. Still, his determination couldn't be diminished. It had been the right decision, and Kiba wouldn't let Hinata go alone and die. The team was like a family to the three. They had been through so much together. But what now? What village? Which country? What jobs? He might never see his family again. Another silent groan escaped him. Suddenly, a strange jab into his neck pulled Kiba out of his thoughts. It had been almost soft, but still he felt it, and it appeared somehow familiar. He turned around, but his body slumped down. Surprisingly, instead of falling, he was held firmly. Somebody prevented him from falling hard on the ground. What the fuck? No. A murmur was all he could manage to press out, another soft jab. Damn it. Hinata's pale face appeared in front of him. It was scrunched up, and Kiba felt wet drops falling onto his forehead. He felt a tiny warm kiss on his cheek. Hinata, you stubborn idiot, Kiba thought before he blacked out. Gritting her teeth, Hinata carefully laid Kiba on his back. Slowly, she crawled on her knees towards the sleeping Shino. Thick salty tears fell on the ground below her as she continued to crawl. I'm so sorry. She continued crawling. I will protect you. After finally reaching Shino, her gentle palms poked into his back and neck, trying to do it as softly as possible. 1, 2. It was done. Shino would stay unconscious. Again Hinata leaned over her friend and pressed a tiny goodbye kiss on his cheek, knowing that this was probably the last time she would see both her friends. Now her sobbing was combined with a desperate hiccup. It woke up Akamaru. The hound ran to her and started to lick her face in attempt to comfort her. Akamaru, Hinata cried out, snuggling her head into the hound's warm neck. I'm so sorry. Watch over them, okay. Akamaru whimpered and she stroked his head. Thank you, Akamaru. The big dog's trusting eyes looked at Hinata. She couldn't take it anymore. Quickly, she stood up and covered Kiba with a blanket. I can't take you with me. All she managed to force out was a whisper as she was trying to stop her nervous hiccup. After walking over to Shino, Hinata adjusted his blanket, tucking him in. I have to protect you from myself. Becoming rogues and giving up their lives wasn't what she wished for her friends. Further, she couldn't risk their lives, especially when she was the deadly threat. Hinata took the bag Shino had given her, put the Yamanaka scrolls into it, and turned around. The next minute felt like an hour, though the atmosphere was almost peaceful. Hinata's light watery eyes tried to memorize her friends sleeping by the fire. Her team. My friends. Her lips started to tremble, and she turned away, taking 2 steps away from them. Suddenly, she stopped and turned around one more time, glancing at her friends. But her sobbing got worse, and she turned her head away again. Please forgive me, Hinata groaned, wiping her tears away with her bloody hand. So much more was left to say, but her lips felt seamed together. They couldn't hear her anyway. It was time to go. The sound of Hinata's feet pounding into the ground drowned out her loud heartbeat. Her heart ached. She had killed a comrade and betrayed the people who were willing to leave everything behind to go with her. They would be unconscious for at least 1 or 2 days. Neji, where are you? Was this only a dream? As a thick rain shower started pouring down, Hinata pulled the hood of her coat over her head. The rain would make it impossible for Kiba and Akamaru to follow. They would need to go back to Konoha. The large raindrops pelted against her body. Her friends would return home. It was their home, not hers anymore. She would continue to be on the run. I'm so sorry, Kiba and Shino. Hours passed as she shuffled through the woods. Toxic thoughts tortured her, increasing her suffering with every step she took. Being with her friends had increased the feeling of normality, and now she was on her own. What have I done? I've become a monster. Can't trust myself, can't control myself. If I don't stay alone, I could hurt somebody else. Where could she go? The perspectives weren't bright and shiny. She lowered her head, thinking about it. What could she do? It made no sense to her as she had left everything behind. Her family, her friends, her home. A life without it seemed worthless for her. She became more tired. After a while, she stopped running. No energy was left and only a little chakra to maintain her Byakugan. Sitting with her back leaning on a tree, she pulled her knees to her body and laid her head on her arms. Slowly, she started dozing off, even though her Byakugan was still activated. Hinata had a strange dream again. Trees surrounded her as she saw was the back of a person with long dark hair standing far away from her. Neji. Her shouting caused the figure to turn around, exposing his face. No, it wasn't Neji, though it was a tall man. His eyes were closed, his long hair was tied in a ponytail. Somehow he looked tired. No, that is not Neji. Who is it? Who are you? Hinata whispered. His mouth opened in surprise, and he slowly started opening his eyes. It seemed he wanted to say something. Even though it wasn't her cousin, he reminded her of somebody, but she couldn't tell who it might be. She had never seen him. Further, somehow she wasn't scared of him. But why? Reaching out her hand, she took a small step towards him. However, he was too far away. With his eyes still closed, he also reached out his hand. That was precisely the moment she woke up. Opening her weary eyes, she scanned her surroundings with her still activated Byakugan. Strange. Did she sleep with her Byakugan activated? First, it seemed clear, but then her eyes widened, and a shiver ran over her skin. Her dojutsu recognized a person only some kilometers away from her. And that somebody was sprinting right toward her at an inhuman speed. There was no more time left to escape. Who was it? Chapter 7. Meet me in the woods tonight. After jumping up, Hinata took her usual fighting stance as the tall figure suddenly appeared right in front of her. There wasn't even a second to react before she felt the cold side of metal pressed to her neck. She jerked her arm forward to reach a tenketsu on the attacker's neck, but he leaned back a second before she could reach her target. A gentle fist. He mumbled, pressing the sword even closer to her neck. I wouldn't try attacking me again if I were you. That's my last warning. Hearing the low voice made Hinata freeze. Hadn't she heard it before somewhere? Casting a sideways glance at him, she gasped. Short dark hair, mismatched eyes, one crimson, one violet, frowning face, and that chakra signature. Saw Sasuke. Hinata muttered. Neji, where are you? What should I do now? A silence followed. Both stared at each other. Hinata was panting nervously while his breathing was relaxed and controlled. A frown was stuck on Sasuke's face. They had been in school and the Chunin exams together, but maybe he had forgotten about her, and everything would be fine. A Hyuga. Sasuke finally released his sword and stepped back. Hyuga Hinata. Her answer was a slight nod. She had hoped he wouldn't remember her name, but they had been in school and the Chunin exams after all. With narrowed eyes, Sasuke looked right into her face. Were you in a fight? No, and no. You have blood on your face. Sasuke's facial expression showed a strange mixture of emotion she couldn't read. If Hinata had to choose, she would describe it as curiosity and annoyance. I know. Pursing her lips, she thought of ways out of this situation. As she looked at him, she noticed that he didn't look better. His clothes were filthy and worn down. His hair was greasy, and dust was on his face. No blood, but still, he looked dirty. Neji, where are you? What should I do? How can I get out? Sasuke interrupted her thoughts. Are you here on your own? No, she lied. He tilted his head. So, where's your team? They are nearby. Hinata continued lying, hoping that he wouldn't dig further if he knew she wasn't alone. At nighttime. Yes. Her eyes focused on his. Sasuke was cautious, she sensed it. His red eye was scanning her every move. Why didn't he turn it off? A small shiver ran on her skin. So, where do you meet them? Who? Sasuke cocked his head. He looked at her as if she was an imbecile. Your team. They are some kilometers from here. I'm scouting the territory, Hinata said quietly. His raised eyebrow showed that he was still suspicious. Scouting the territory? Yes. What for? A mission, she replied as vaguely as possible. Damn, he was very talkative. Couldn't he just leave? What mission? Sasuke's eyebrows tightened. Classified. Hinata answered with a short nod. The interrogation started to irritate her. No more talking. I need to leave. Now. The truth was she was tired and had issues concentrating on anything. It was time to go. Trying to be polite, she put on a friendly smile. His response was a stony glare. It was nice meeting you, Sasuke. Please excuse my interruption. With a deep bow, Hinata turned around and started leaving. Take care and good luck. Great. Relieved that this strange encounter was finally coming to an end, Hinata took 2 steps away from him when. You didn't ask why I am here, he suddenly stated in a cold tone. Hinata turned around and looked at him, confused. His Sharingan was still glimmering. So he wanted to fight, after all, or what did that all mean? She sighed. Sorry. Why are you here, Sasuke? He stared at her for some time. None of your business. Hinata looked puzzled. Sure, sorry. I'd better get going, right? Again, she turned around and got ready to jump on the next tree. Are you on the run, Hyuga? As she looked at him, she saw a tiny smirk on his pale face. He knows. Hinata's eyes widened in shock, and she fidgeted slightly. Was he that clever to look through her lies? Did he have the instruction to catch her? Maybe the talking was his gruesome way to play with her before tearing her apart and dragging her corpse back to the village. He took a slow step towards her. What now? Racking her brain for solutions, she went back to her fighting stance. It was a joke. Sasuke frowned, rolling his eyes in annoyance. Why doesn't it surprise me that the Hyuga know no jokes? A joke. That didn't seem like a joke at all. Hinata forced a smile. The resulting fake smile resembled a bizarre grimace. Fortunately, it seemed that he didn't know that in fact, Hinata was on the run. Like a criminal. Scratch that, she was worse. A rogue nin. Or maybe he already knew, and that was the reason why he was here. What did he want? I'll wait with you until you find your team. Sasuke shrugged his shoulders. His statement made Hinata's mouth drop. A nervous chuckle escaped her. Your humor is terrifying, terrific, Sasuke. HMPF. The annoyance in his voice was more than obvious. I wasn't joking. He couldn't be serious, could he? Hinata's eyes widened in shock. Thank you. But that's not necessary. It's fine. A devious grin flashed on his face. You will put in a good word for me as a future clan head of the Hyuga. Clan head. Hinata didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. She was a rogue ninja. Best case would be she would get a caged bird seal and rot in prison. Worst case would be an execution. Not right now. You just owe me one day. Another annoyed eye roll followed as Sasuke turned his head away, leaving no room for further discussion. Sure. She didn't even know why she said, sure, instead of, no. Feeling completely exhausted, she didn't have the strength to fight or argue. The most important thing for her was to get as far away from Kiba and Shino to keep them safe. In case I lose control over my body again. Hinata glanced at Sasuke. Would he be safe with her? The possibility of her turning into a monster again and attacking another person was still there. She didn't want to kill another comrade. However, he was known to be extremely powerful and strong, comparable to Naruto. Without a doubt, her body couldn't manage to harm him, could it? Done staring at me. He darted an irritated glance at her. Yes. I'm sorry. Hinata lowered her eyes, sighing silently. Her goal was to get away as soon as possible. Somehow she found herself in a strange situation. What direction? He asked. It seemed he really wanted to find her team. After a look around, Hinata pointed in any direction which was not leading her back to her team. There. Sasuke started to run. All Hinata could do was shake her head silently. What had just happened here that she found herself alone in the woods with somebody she never spoke to? She started to follow him. Observing Sasuke's back, she thought of ways out of this strange situation. However, she was almost relieved that she needed to deal with that situation instead of concentrating on her own toxic thoughts. The guilt and regret of actions she couldn't even recall. The darkness of the night was breaking as they were running for hours. Sasuke stopped and turned to Hinata. She almost crashed into his back, halting an inch behind him, way too close in his private space. It made her blush a little, and she took a step back. Sorry, she whispered. Without further comments, Sasuke shook his head and said, You're getting slower. We'll take a break. Okay. She lowered her eyes. They sat down between the trees. Didn't you say your team is nearby? He asked with an eyebrow raised. She answered with a nod. I sense them nearby. You can leave me here, thank you. Again she stood up and turned to leave. That was her chance. I'll wait with you until they arrive. They should sense you here, shouldn't they? Yes. It felt like a strange game now. Why didn't he just let her go? What was the sense of all this? But it can take some time, I've got time. Hinata sighed and laid her bag on the ground. Quickly, she collected some wood, and Sasuke lit a fire. They sat there silently. The awful thoughts started torturing Hinata right away. What had happened that night? Why can't I remember? Did I really kill Ino? What happened to me? Am I insane? She rubbed her eyes. Maybe it was just an awful nightmare. Maybe she would wake up in her bed, look into the garden and see Hanabi training with Neji. What did I do? Neji, what happened? Hyuga, it's unsanitary. Hinata's thoughts were interrupted by Sasuke's voice. Stop rubbing the dirt into your eyes. Hesitantly, her hands stopped their motion and moved to her knees. Maybe talking would annoy him enough to leave. She cleared her throat. So, Sasuke, what do you do? Atoning. Ah, I see. Hinata smiled a little. And where do you go next? Don't know yet. I see. The conversation was lagging, and Hinata didn't know what to ask next. He was atoning. Great. It surprised her that Sasuke suddenly engaged in the conversation. Anything new in Konoha? His voice was calm. And no, she replied. Apart from the fact that she was a rogue, there was nothing worth mentioning. Lost in thought, she looked down on the ground, feeling her eyes getting watery again. It took some strength to fight the urge to cry. Sasuke cleared his throat. Don't you want to eat something? I'm not hungry. Hinata didn't eat for at least a whole day, but there was no wish to eat. He looked at her, and she turned away when she felt his eyes on her face. After a long silence, Hinata gave him a sideways glance. Are you hungry? I can take care of myself. Sasuke shrugged his shoulders. He looked away, but his stomach growled just at that moment. Hinata blinked at him. I saw some mushrooms over there. I can grill us some if you want to. A low grunt was audible and Sasuke turned away. Happy for a task to distract herself, Hinata stood up and started collecting the mushrooms. It wasn't a difficult task for her. She was used to it after all the years. There was even a river nearby to fill in their bottles and wash things. She even remembered that she gave both Shino and Kiba some spices. Knowing they always had them in their bags, she looked at the side of the bag she got from them. And they were there. Grateful, she seasoned the mushrooms and placed them on a long stick above the fireplace. They ate in silence. Again, she was alone with her thoughts. I had to go. I couldn't risk their lives. Hinata swallowed at the thought again. There was no way back. She couldn't risk her subconscious taking over her body and harming her loved ones again. Even if that meant that she would be alone. Even if that meant that she would die. Protecting her friends was her promise. Where are you now, Neji? Did I just imagine you? Both voices were silent now in her head, but now there was no way back. They're good. Sasuke's voice interrupted her thoughts once again. Hey, she looked at him in confusion. The food. Rolling his eyes, he pointed at the mushrooms. Oh, I'm glad. The compliment let her forget the thoughts for a second, and her lips turned into a tiny smile. It almost felt like a mission with her team. Seems like they still aren't here. Didn't you say you sensed them? The irritation was ringing in Sasuke's voice. Hinata felt helpless. What should she say? Of course, her team wouldn't come. She didn't want them to find her. I don't sense them here right now. Fine, let's camp here. She nodded slightly, thinking about her friends. Fortunately, it had rained, and now tracking the smells would be way harder for Kiba when he would wake up. To conceal her scent, she would need to take a bath. She stood up and walked some steps away from the fire where Sasuke was still sitting silently. He just stared into the fire. His peaceful look made her envious. She sat down away from him, so she couldn't see him. After opening the bag Shino had given her, Hinata pulled out the things Kiba and Shino had packed. A fresh shirt, fresh underwear, a water bottle, a small comb, a bar of soap, a toothbrush, and 2 small plastic bags. When leaving Konoha, she didn't have the time to pack for herself. Now, her only belongings were the things her teammates had packed into his bag. They packed it. For her. She felt a lump in her throat. Hearing strange noises caused Sasuke to walk around until he found Hinata sitting on a stone nearby. A fresh shirt and underwear from her backpack lay on her lap. Also, a plastic bag was on top of the clothes. Tears were running down her dirty face, and she was weeping bitterly. What is it? Sasuke asked coldly. Hinata's face was scrunched up as she looked up to him, pointing to the plastic bag. He looked over and saw that it was filled with sweet pastries. Melon and cinnamon buns. KK Kiba, she mumbled, quickly wiping away the tears from her face. So, Sasuke's face was blank, but somehow he felt irritated watching her cry like that. It's Shino's bag. They packed it. Her sobs were interrupted by a desperate hiccup. That's Abarame's bag. Raising his eyebrow, Sasuke watched her carefully. Hinata nodded silently, still looking at the pastries. The tears ran down her cheeks. Why was she sobbing over some sweets from her teammates? Sasuke didn't understand this at all. She was so strange. He watched Hinata crying and tilted his head. A frown appeared on his face, and he kneeled next to her. So, you stole your teammate's underwear. Hinata's mouth dropped. And no, he packed it for. I will keep that in mind. I better be careful with my things around you. One corner of Sasuke's lip twitched for a second before he turned his head away. Wah! Hinata's face flushed. No, he repeated, turning his head to her again. A tiny smirk was on his lips. You're telling me you're not going to wear his underwear? Hinata gritted her teeth while her face got redder. He waited patiently, almost sadistically, for her to finally finish her sentence. Yes, I will, she whispered. Of course, she would. The things from Abaram's bag seemed to be the only belongings she had taken with her. It would be stupid not to wear fresh clothes and underwear. Both knew that. That's what I thought. I heard about the Hyuga but never thought I'd witness it myself. Hinata stared at him, but still the corner of her lip pulled up even though the tears were still covering her face. We Hyuga don't do anything. Really? Then tell me, what do your strange eyes see? She went silent and thought about that question. What do your eyes see? Shrugging his shoulders, Sasuke grumbled, you wouldn't get it. Probably. At least, they agreed on that. Hinata sighed and stood up. I'm going to take a bath. Yeah, you look like you could use it. Excuse me. You look filthy. A scowl appeared on her face. Wah, hey, you're covered in blood and mud. He shrugged his shoulders. You almost look dead yourself. Have you looked in the mirror lately? Hinata mumbled as she started packing her things for the bath. He raised his eyebrow. Did she really dare to? Did you say anything? Both stared at each other for some time. No. Hinata lowered her eyes again. Then suddenly, a cheeky smile flashed on her face for a millisecond. But if you want, I can lend you my soap. Sasuke's mouth opened and closed while he was staring at her. It would have been the perfect time for a counter, but he couldn't come up with more than, HN. Hinata's mouth formed an almost invisible winning smile. Sasuke tisked and turned away. After standing up, she got lost in thoughts again. Some days ago she had been with her friends in her village. Now she was alone in the woods with somebody she had never spoken to before. Her eyes focused on Sasuke for a while. He was strange. A past Nukenin. Ironically, she was a rogue now, and he didn't know that. What are you waiting for? Don't tell me you need somebody to babysit you while you're bathing. Sasuke interrupted her thoughts. Hinata's face flushed red again. No. Then go. Sasuke rolled his eyes. I wouldn't do it anyway. Huffing at his rudeness, Hinata stomped away. Sasuke was so blunt and awkward, really strange. But he wasn't as bad as people said, Hinata noticed. Ironically, she found him kind of funny. It almost seemed that he had been mocking her to stop crying, but she didn't really believe that. His bluntness reminded her of Neji, Kiba, and Shino. Thinking about them made her shiver. It took Hinata some time to get to the river. Quickly, she undressed and stepped into the ice-cold water, holding the bar of soap in her hands. Thanks to her Byakugan, she wasn't afraid of intruders. But it was dark there, only the moon gave some light. Where are you, Neji? Hinata whispered, looking up to the moonlit sky before dipping her head into the icy water. Being on her own in this situation felt awful. Especially now that she was searched for crimes she couldn't even remember. After pulling her head out of the water, she started soaping her head and body with Kiba's soap. It smelled like mint and a bit like home. Hinata's gaze shifted to the dark liquid beneath her, and she saw the reflection of her pale body. Suddenly, she thought to catch a glimpse of Neji's reflection in the water. Neji. But no answer came back. The reflection instantly changed into her frame again. Did I really see him? I must be imagining again. Shaking her head, she acknowledged her exhaustion. After finishing her bath, she trotted back to the place she was camping with Sasuke. He was still sitting by the fire and gave her a nod. Slowly, she started hanging up the clothes she had washed in the river next to the fire. When she glanced at him, she saw that his eyes were stuck on her neck. Didn't you say you weren't in a fight? He asked quietly. Why yes. I'm surprised that your teammates would choke you like this, but every team trains in their own way, I guess. Sasuke shrugged his shoulders. Hinata had removed her headband and forgotten about the marks on her neck. Instantly, a dark frown covered her face. The false accusation triggered the emotions she tried to hide. Don't talk about them like that. With an unspoken question in his eyes, he cocked his head. Fine. Turning away from him, Hinata lay on her back. She clenched her fists too hard. How dare he accuse her team of hurting her? When she cooled down, she thought about her last dream, a man with long dark hair. Somehow the day changed everything again. Never would she have guessed she would meet Sasuke in the woods. After some time, she started to drift into sleep, suddenly feeling the ramifications of her exhaustion. Just as she was already half asleep, she heard Sasuke's low voice. Excuse me, do you mind if I go back on your kind offer to lend me your soap? Sure, it's in my bag, right on top, she mumbled drowsily. Thank you very much. Sleep well. Even though Hinata was half asleep, she noticed once again how strange he was. The sudden change of mood was irritating, but it appeared that this was another attempt to mock her. Sasuke walked over to Hinata's bag. His hand searched for the soap, but it wasn't at the top. It must have fallen into the bag. First, he looked at Hinata's back facing him. Her breath was slow and controlled. She seemed to be fast asleep. Sasuke started digging further, but it wasn't that easy with one hand. Bringing it closer to himself, he looked into it, and suddenly he stopped in his movements. His Sharingan glimmered red for a second. For several minutes he was staring into the bag until he finally picked the soap and stood up. In her dream, Hinata saw a large house, the Hyuga main building. Her home. The sky above was cloudy and it smelled like rain. All doors and windows were covered by massive wooden planes. Slowly, Hinata walked closer to the house and stood in front of the plane blocking the front door. Her hand touched the wooden surface. It felt warm and firm. A knock came from the inside of the house. Neji. Hinata shouted and knocked back. The knocking stopped for a second before it started again. Hinata pulled her hand back and started pounding her fist into the wood. However, it was as hard as a stone, not giving in an inch. She started kicking into it. It didn't change anything. After numerous attempts to destroy the plane, Hinata sat down and leaned against the plane. I can't get into the house. There's no way in. When the first sunrays fell on Hinata's face, she opened her eyes. Slowly she sat up, thinking about the dream. What could it mean? Was Neji? You're talking in your sleep. The usual annoyance was swinging in Sasuke's voice. Now, that was new. Neither Kiba nor Shino ever complained about Hinata talking while being asleep. You're talking in your sleep, Sasuke repeated as if she was deaf. You're calling your name and your cousin's. Oh, sorry. Once again, she lowered her eyes and thought about it. Speaking in her sleep was still better than attacking. A deep sigh escaped her. It's fine. It wasn't loud. Okay. Hinata peered at Sasuke and noticed that he had washed away the dirt from his face too. You look better. It just escaped her mouth, and she wanted to take it back, but it was too late. What is that supposed to mean? He raised his eyebrow. You look clean, she said quietly, shrugging her shoulders. It was the truth. And I see you really love being dirty. A sly smirk appeared on Sasuke's face. Hinata's mouth dropped open, and her face suddenly started to feel warm. Wah! His face turned deadpan as he pointed at her hands. Looking down, she saw that mud was sticking to her fingers. How strange. It seemed that she had been digging her fingers into the soil while sleeping. Without any further words, Sasuke stood up and walked away in the direction of the river. He had his toothbrush in his hand, so she assumed that was his objective. Her fingers were covered in mud. How strange. Why would she stick her fingers into the cold, sticky mud while sleeping? When Hinata examined her hands, she found 2 words each written in each palm of her hands. 2 words written with mud. Still, here.